All right. I am now joined by Matt McManus, who is, you can read in Jacobin and Ario and various other places. I think that Matt always has at least one book coming out, so I've lost track a little bit, but maybe you can fill us in. And Russell Sbriglia, who people may know, among other contexts, because of the series that's been going on what used to be the TMBS channel of what basically a really spread out panel of series of panels of academic scholars who went on the Michael Brooks show over the years, which I've certainly been watching or listening to in some cases. I was on one of them. So welcome, guys.
Good to see you, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, I should say, by the way, before we go any further, so Russell is the person who very kindly hooked me up with Slavoj Žižek, who is the main guest on the last regular GTAA episode of the year, which is coming out tomorrow. That was recorded on Saturday, but it's going through some editing. It's been put out tomorrow. It was a lot of fun. The only people who've seen it so far are patrons, but one of the patron comments was find a man who looks at you like Ben is looking at Žižek. So I must have been enjoying it. But yeah, we are here. He's a good, he has so much, whatever. I mean, it's I've seen lots of interviews with Žižek. He was how he is, but it's very it's always really engaging, and it was a lot of fun to be part of that. And I love all of his little all the the unpredictable references and connections. He which obviously is something he always does. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing the finished product.
Yeah. So he encouraged me to channel my inner Stalinist and brutally censor it to make it seem like he wasn't saying things he was. But yeah, no, it was good. He brought whatever as an analytic philosophy nerd. I've mentioned that I was very happy when he brought up Russell's paradox out of nowhere. Definitely wasn't expecting that. And again, I love the historical references. He had he brought up that thing about Lenin going out to dance in the snow the day that the USSR had officially existed for one day longer than the Paris Commune. Which was always going to stick in my head. But yeah, let's set this up. So we have been doing this every Sunday, watching these classic debates that are on YouTube and commenting on them. So the one we are going to do today is Chomsky Foucault, and what do you guys want to set this up a little bit of background?
Do you want to go first, Russell, or should I?
Matt, you can go ahead, and then I'll try to fill things out if I can.
Sure. I should say, well, just to begin with, I spend an awful lot of time reading both of these authors. Personally, I tend to be a bigger fan of Chomsky than I am of Foucault, in no small part because I think his linguistic theories are revolutionary in their implications, and also because I think I'm a kind of creamy, dreamy rationalist at heart. So that's kind of where on the spectrum I end up lying. On the other hand, I do think that there are substantial problems with the approach that Chomsky sometimes takes to politics, which is to dissociate it from things like broader ideological critique, appeals to affect, and so on and so forth. And that's where I think Foucault is a lot stronger in analyzing the different ways various forms of subjectivity can be constituted, the discourses that they tend to involve themselves in, and all the stuff that I'm sure that will come up here. I watched this debate a long, long time ago, I should say. I think it must have been in the second or third year of my undergraduate degree. And one of my professors pointed out that you can also really see the difference in academic cultures between France and the United States by looking at them. Because you saw Chomsky, and he was dressed in a nice enough suit, and he's kind of there looking a bit like a tweedy, MIT, Harvard type dude. But then there was Michel Foucault, who looked like he was just made for TV. You know what I mean? The coiffed head, the elegant gestures, speaking very pointedly about everything. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, well, it's the difference between academics in France and academics in the United States. Academics in the United States through the Vietnam War, pretty much widely hated. Academics in France are basically mini celebrities. And no one was a bigger one than Foucault at that time. And I was like, oh, Jesus, I'd like the fucking celebrity treatment at one point, roll out the red carpet.
Yeah, I think I'm coming from it. I don't want to say a plague on both of their houses, because I actually really find useful and I mean, in some instances, revolutionary thought in both of them. I don't know if I would pick one over the other, but coming more from the continental side of things myself, my first impulse is almost to side with Foucault, but then also as somebody who works in psychoanalysis, Marxism, despite I come from literary studies, and the past 30 years or longer has been like the main paradigm has been heavily Foucauldian. And so to have gone through graduate school in literary studies anytime before 2010, you would have been it varies from program to program, but you would have been steeped in this sort of Foucauldian historicism. Having said that, so I think theoretically I'm actually more aligned with Foucault, even though I have a lot of problems with him, but politically, and we'll see this, I think that ultimately politically I'm much more closely aligned with Chomsky. So it's a weird position where theoretically I think Foucault has a bit of the upper hand, but politically I think that even though Foucault says that he is a leftist, I think that Foucault has been in large part, or maybe like Foucauldianism has been in large part responsible for a sort of attenuation of not so much political commitment, but of a focus on the political as such, especially in the academy over the past like 30, 40 years. So that's sort of my preamble about this.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, I just want to say one of the unfortunate realities of the situation is that we've had decades and decades of Chomsky where we can kind of mince his political positions, get a good sense of how they've evolved and changed over time. I really think the best was yet to come for Foucault when he tragically passed away far too young, especially because I think the kind of left Nietzschean expressivism that you really find in his later works, where he starts to talk about how it is that, we can engage in projects of self-creation, was very interesting. Sadly, he passed away before he ever really gave us a systematic work in the vein of that project. So we have to kind of fill in the blanks there.
Yeah. I think actually a lot of what both of you said resonates with me. I think Chomsky, Chomsky is certainly somebody who politically, I think is right about just about everything. I did certainly I think all of the most important topics that he's tackled, from his sort of bread and butter stuff about the, day-to-day evils of capitalism and imperialism to things that are maybe a little bit further out on the edge, like his defense, even within the left, of free speech. I think most of my critique of Chomsky politically isn't about what he does say, but about what he doesn't say, about the things that I think are important that are left out of his projects. And Foucault, I think there's some ambiguity there politically, because certainly there were times in his life when he was he was embracing a very radical left kind of message. I think there's some ambiguities about that, especially later in his career. And I do agree with some of what Russ says about the about the way that that his influence, has not always been benign, especially, in academia. Certainly as far as philosophical style, I've already admitted to be, well, actually, let's put it this way, to combine the question of philosophical style with what Matt brought up originally about personal style. I think that I think about this often, that like I'm in the slightly odd position as somebody who does still have a day job as an academic, that I really, I'm an analytic philosophy nerd, as I mentioned earlier, right? Like I really like that stuff. But I absolutely hate most academic philosophers, like, because most of them are like annoying dweebs who like, prefer Elizabeth Warren to Bernie Sanders, and, and are obsessed with civility and are woke in exactly the wrong ways, and, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So, there are like 10 people who do this, who I actually like. And I'll just leave it at that, so people can guess about whether they're in the 10. So I think certainly in terms of style of doing philosophy, I mean, obviously Chomsky is, much closer to where I come from. But I'll just say this before we start. Something that has always made me laugh since learning it is that apparently Chomsky, as far as I know, being a square, was paid in money for this debate, whereas Foucault demanded that the organizers pay him in hash, and so then for a while afterwards, every time that he and his friends would smoke it, they'd say, "Oh, yeah, it's time to break out the Chomsky hash."
That's great. I didn't know that.
All right, let's start it up. All right, let's maybe skip past the intro. It's gonna be long enough as is.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the fourth debate of the International Philosophers Project. Tonight's debaters are Mr. Michel Foucault, the Collège de France, and Mr. Noam Chomsky of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Both philosophers have points in common and points of difference. Perhaps the best way to compare both philosophers is to look at them as mountain diggers working at the opposite side of the same mountains with different tools, without knowing even if they are working in each other's direction. All learning concerning man, ranging from history to linguistics and psychology, are faced with the question whether in the last instance we are the product of all kinds of external factors, or if in spite of our differences, we have something we could call a common human nature by which we can call each other human beings. So my first question is to Mr. Chomsky, because you, Mr. Chomsky, employ often the concept.
Are they drinking orange juice?
And even in this connection, you are using terms
Screwdrivers?
like
Is that what those are?
Yeah, probably more likely. Yeah.
Which arguments can you derive from linguistics in order to give such a central position to this notion of human nature?
Well, let me begin in a slightly technical way. A person who's interested in studying language is faced with a very definite empirical problem. He's faced with an organism, a mature, let's say, adult speaker, who has somehow acquired an amazing range of abilities which enable him in particular to say what he means, to understand what people say to him, to do this in a fashion that I think it's proper to call highly creative. Now, the person who's acquired this intricate and highly articulated and organized collection of abilities, the collection of abilities that we call knowing a language, that person has been exposed to a certain experience. He has been presented in the course of his lifetime with a certain amount of data, of direct experience with the language. And we can investigate the data that's available to this person. And having done so, in principle, we're faced with a very clear and a reasonably clear and well delineated scientific problem, namely the problem of accounting for the gap between the really quite small quantity of data, small and rather degenerate quantity of data that's presented to the person, to the child, and the very highly articulated, highly systematic, profoundly organized resulting knowledge that he somehow derives from this data. Furthermore, even more remarkable, we notice that in a wide range of languages, in fact, all that have been studied seriously, there are remarkable limitations on the kinds of system that emerge from the very different kinds of experience to which people are exposed. Well, there's only one possible explanation for it in a what one can say in a rather schematic fashion for this remarkable phenomenon, namely the assumption that the individual himself contributes a good deal, an overwhelming part, in fact, of the general schematic structure and perhaps even of the specific content of the knowledge that he ultimately derives from this very scattered and limited experience. That is, to put it rather loosely, the child must begin with the knowledge, certainly not with the knowledge that he's hearing English or Dutch or French or something else, but he does start with the knowledge that he's hearing a human language of a very narrow and explicit type that permits a very small range of variation. And it's because he begins with that highly organized and very restrictive schematism that he's able to make the huge leap from scattered and degenerate data to highly organized knowledge. And I would claim then that this instinctive knowledge, if you like, this schematism that makes it possible to derive complex and intricate knowledge on the basis of very partial data, is one fundamental constituent of human nature. But then I assume that in other domains of human intelligence and other domains of human cognition and even behavior, something of the same sort must be true. Well, the collection of this mass of innate schematisms, innate organizing principles, which guides our social and intellectual and individual behavior, that's what I mean to refer to by the concept of human nature.
Well, Mr. Foucault, if I'm thinking at your books like Histoire de la Folie...
I was going to say, I do love the way that he articulates these kind of positions in a very technical language that's nonetheless extremely accessible and relatively clear to a lay audience. He does this in his books on the subject also, like his book on human nature that came out, I think, just like 3 or 4 years ago. Same kind of thing.
Yeah,
I like the shot of the raft, the woman in the rafters. What the camera guy was making his money on this one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it gives you a sense of how packed this is. Yeah, no, I like that too about Chomsky, that there's like even as he's saying that, like even as part of me is like, okay, sure. I mean, is this exactly the relevant sense of human nature or whatever? But I mean, I think there's real virtue in that because, by like really nailing it down like that, all right, well, if it's not, right, you could at least explain why not, so it's at least very clear what the starting point is.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like his linguistic program hasn't evolved over time, which is another feature of it that I quite admire, actually. Like he dropped a lot of the stuff about deep and surface grammars that was extremely popular in the 1970s iteration, and adopted what was called later the minimalist program in reaction to some criticisms by evolutionary biologists and evolutionary linguistics, while still kind of holding true to the rationalist core of his thinking. So I do like that, right? Like he's a pretty adaptable guy when it comes to his approach to linguistics.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen him say that, that basically, like, this isn't the exact quote, but something along the lines of, look, like the things I'm saying politically aren't really going to change very much. I mean, I was against imperialist wars. I'm going to be against imperialist wars. Yeah. But I would see it as an intellectual failure if what I was saying about linguistics and cognitive science was the same in 10 years.
Yeah, and I know a number of people have asked him, like, what's the connection between your scientific and philosophical work on generative grammar and your politics? And sometimes he says there's absolutely no relation between the two. I wear two different hats. One where I'm effectively a kind of philosophical scientist or linguist or whatever it happens to be. The other where I'm a political commentator. But in some other interviews, he suggests that there is a relation between the two, in the sense that he's committed to an enlightenment project, fundamentally, right? Mature enlightenment project, where reason and human creativity can be used adaptively to solve fundamental political problems, and that societies as they are right now are insufficiently free to allow us to use our complicated cognitive hardware to actually resolve a lot of the difficulties that we face in a constructive manner, which is why we need to see some very profound changes. And I kind of like it like that, in the sense that he's very overtly aligning himself with historical project, where I think that I think actually has a lot of gas left in the tank, and he's not afraid to make that kind of association without kind of falling into the kind of cheesy enlightenism that you see with people like Steven Pinker and so on.
Fair enough. Let's watch.
I just like that he's showing some leg. I mean, he's got to compete with the Frenchman here, and so he's going to be a little risque for Chomsky, frankly. No, really. Once we start getting into, I'll have more substantive things to say. But he went straight for that orange juice though, as well. I mean, yeah. And yeah, I'd love to know if that is just orange juice or not, but who knows? All right.
It might be in his case. I'd be shocked if it was just orange juice in Foucault's case.
Yeah, that seems right. All right, let's check it out.
Working on a completely different level, and also just with an opposite aim, opposite goal. If I'm thinking about the word schematism in relation to human nature, then you are just trying to work out that there are several periods, several schematisms. What do you think about this?
Well, if you permit, I will answer in French, because my English is so bad that I would be ashamed to answer in English. Là, il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Mais je m'en méfie pour la raison suivante. Je crois que parmi les concepts,
The video description said that there'd be subtitles. Let's see.
Oh yeah, I think I found this one the other day. They're lying.
Oh, they're lying. Okay. All right. Well, I think there's another one that might. So let's.
There is one. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just go over to that, or else we're gonna give Noam a unfair retroactive advantage here for most of our audience.
Mm-hmm.
I
do like though how Foucault says how bad his English is, and then it's perfect English. That's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that. It's like that scene at the beginning of *Inglourious Bastards*. When Hans Landau, who's been speaking French clearly fluently, and he's like, "Well, I've exhausted my French. Let's switch to English."
Yeah, I mean, he was teaching at American universities had paid positions at American like visiting positions, and was giving lectures, some in English. So it's
I remember he went to San Francisco to be part of the LGBTQ scene there. I think it was like post 1975 or something. I can't remember. This debate was in 1973, wasn't it? Or it was right around the end of the Vietnam War. So
like 72. There's actually, he was at university. I did my master's at University of Buffalo, and he was in Buffalo for a year. And there's still photographs of him with with faculty. Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely want to get that picture if you had the chance. I was going to say, Russell, the funny thing is about your experience is actually we had many similarities in our educational upbringing, because we used to joke around in my program at York that the university should just be renamed Foucault U, since he was so dominant in the social sciences, right? Yeah, kind of the standard project you would do if you're a master's in socio-legal studies is discourse analysis of some form of power, right?
Well, it's exactly. And, actually it's interesting because I was just reviewing like a proposal for a diversity requirement or diversity component, and it was dismissed by somebody else who's reviewing it as sort of Marxist indoctrination. And it was the furthest thing from like the notion of it was just power and about power differentials. And it was mostly about Like that was the primary lens. The primary lens was entirely Foucauldian, but the fact that it's perceived as being Marxist, I think, is actually part of the problem. But yeah, I mean, Foucault is still everywhere, and I think like politically in some regards for in our current moment for the worse. But you know, I don't want to just hate on Foucault. I think he's a really important thinker. I'm sure you know you do as well.
No, I think there are serious problems with his philosophy. Even fans of his, I know, think there are serious problems with his philosophy. My favorite secondary work on Foucault is Thomas Lemke's book on governmentality. And he says, you know, guy's brilliant, analysis of power, great, da-da-da-da. At the end of it, you have no idea what you should do. You know what I mean? You're kind of left with the sense that the world is full of crap. Then any effort to try to change it could make it actually more crappy. So we should just sit there and be critical. And that's not a really inspiring message. On the other hand, I do think that there's a tremendous amount to a lot of his analyses that are extraordinarily creative and evocative. Even people like Roger Scruton, who naturally aren't exactly the biggest fans of someone like Michel Foucault, will admire the rigor and kind of power of a work like Discipline and Punish. So I think the temptation that some leftists get into to just dismiss him wholesale as, you know, anti-Marxist or kind of a covert reactionary is also not the way to go. I've been guilty of that myself, I should say. So
the last episode I had Nicholas Kiersey on, who's kind of a like left socialist, you know, Foucault guy. So I guess he's like the he's the real example of what Jordan Peterson's always talking about. But yeah, and actually, by the way, I'm glad you brought up Scruton. That reminds me, I should write this down. So somebody in the chat suggests that for one of these Sunday debate breakdowns, we do Terry Eagleton, Roger Scruton, which would be fun.
Yeah.
But anyway, we figured out the subtitle issues. So let's go back to this.
Là, il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Mais je m'en méfie pour la raison suivante. Je crois que parmi les concepts, parmi les notions dont une science peut se servir, il y a évidemment des notions qui sont d'un niveau, qui ont une élaboration, qui est une fonction différente. Par exemple, prenons le cas de la biologie. À l'intérieur, dans le domaine de la biologie, vous avez des concepts qui sont plus ou moins bien établis, comme le concept de réflexe. Bon. Et puis, vous avez d'autres notions qui sont en quelque sorte des notions périphériques. Des notions périphériques qui ne jouent pas un rôle en quelque sorte organisateur à l'intérieur de la science, des concepts qui ne sont pas des instruments d'analyse, des concepts qui ne sont pas descriptifs non plus. Ce sont des notions en quelque sorte qui servent simplement à indiquer des problèmes ou encore qui servent à indiquer des domaines d'objets à étudier. Prenez par exemple, il y a une notion comme ça qui, je crois, était très importante dans l'histoire de la biologie. C'est tout simplement la notion de vie. Bon, au XVIIe ou au XVIIIe siècle, les gens qui étudiaient la nature ne se servaient pas du concept de vie. Ils classaient les êtres naturels, qu'ils soient vivants ou non vivants, dans une espèce de grand tableau ou de grande hiérarchie. La vie était une notion dont ils ne se servaient pas et dont ils n'avaient pas besoin. Et puis, à la fin du XVIIIe siècle, un certain nombre de problèmes se sont posés, comme par exemple les problèmes de l'organisation intérieure de ces êtres dont on avait fait la classification. Ou bien encore, avec les progrès du microscope, le microscope d'Amici, on a vu apparaître tout un tas de phénomènes qui n'avaient pas été jusque-là encore perçus et dont les mécanismes, dont le fonctionnement n'était pas encore clair. Les progrès de la chimie ont fait également apparaître les problèmes concernant les rapports entre les réactions chimiques et les processus physiologiques de l'organisme. Et voilà que tout un domaine d'objets est apparu, domaine d'objets absolument nouveau pour le biologiste, et c'est cela qui a été appelé la vie. Et la vie, c'était une notion qui servait à indiquer le champ des objets et des domaines nouveaux que la science avait à parcourir. Bon, et je dirais, comme ça, en historien des sciences, si vous voulez, que la notion de vie a été un indicateur épistémologique, un index des problèmes à parcourir, et je me demande si on ne pourrait pas dire la même chose de la nature humaine.
Foucault vergelijkt dus het begrip menselijke natuur van Chomsky.
I should say that I think he's
met het begrip
underplaying
leven
the
en de
radicalness
biologie
of his
en de
argument a
geschiedenis
little
van
bit
dat
here.
En hij doet dat
Since in the order of
met het
things, he
begrip
did testify to the idea that the concept of man was going to be
meer
washed
beziet
away.
als
Yeah. I mean, I think you really start to see here the difference between, I think, because they kind of, this is where they start, I think, talking past each other. Because, I mean, you have, I think this is too simplistic, but I mean, I think with Foucault, you have an epistemologist, and with Chomsky, you have, to a certain degree, an empiricist. And the response, I mean, I don't want to, spoil it, but the response that Chomsky gives, I think, doesn't really address what Foucault is talking about. But when he, these for him are like the concept of life wouldn't be, if you were in the 16th century, of course you would know what life is, but you wouldn't, it wouldn't have the sort of scientific weight or the way in which it's framed through as a scientific inquiry into wouldn't exist in the same thing. And so it's really sort of that response or that sort of opening gambit by Foucault there is very much where he's saying, he starts off saying, I have a problem with human nature, right? And he would say, well, human nature is a concept that was developed at a certain point in the 17th, 18th centuries. And so there is no such thing as, or no such idea as human nature outside of a certain episteme, right? Or episteme. And I think that when that Chomsky, because it's interesting that Chomsky, you'll see agrees with him at certain points, but I think that their approach is so different that they're sort of making sideways glances at each other a bit.
Yeah, actually, I think it's a little interesting that he uses that analogy about life, because if what he's saying here is that there just is no such, we can't even ask this question of whether there's human nature outside of the context of some sort of epistemic framework that that it's defined in, then it seems like, I don't know. To me, it seems like life is exactly the sort of thing that, even aside from the ways that I think his history is a little dubious there, that would really undermine that, right? Like, it's the kind of analogy that's like, okay, well, hold on. Sure, the sort of current biological understanding of what life is in terms of chemical processes is a little bit different, but is it really true that Aristotle, or for that matter, medieval peasant, didn't know what life was? That seems, or we're just using it to mean something different from what everybody else means. That seems a little implausible, right? This is I'm thinking here about Kripke's thing about water, which is okay. So it's a what we're referring to would we say water is, and in his view always has been, H2O. But the discovery that water is H2O is still a historically, recent discovery, which, right. Whatever you think about that, I have to say, at least as a intuitive gut check, right? It seems deeply strange to me to say that, that medieval peasants didn't know what water was or what life was, or that, previous, philosophers and scientists in previous eras, didn't know what this means. Honestly, if anything, the life analogy seems to slightly undersell, the case that Foucault can make about human nature, because human nature isn't like life, which is some term that, was introduced into the language to describe something that we all at least have a rough intuitive sense of what we mean by, even if we don't have a full scientific theory of it. Human nature seems more like an intellectual term of art, and what Foucault is saying about that is probably a little bit more plausible than saying it about life.
I actually wanted to give a slightly different interpretation, since I actually agree wholeheartedly with Chomsky on this point. And Foucault, I think, actually would be better understood as a historian of science, right? And in some sense, he's skeptical of the way that the concept of human nature has been used to justify various discourses and associated forms of power, right? And I'm all for that in a certain respect. But I do think it can be tempting to push this thesis too far and transform, as he does in The Order of Things, history into being kind of the or discipline. And I think that that just leads to certain implausible conclusions that really don't explain a lot. I mean, one of the things that Chomsky pointed out in his role as a linguist is if all you're concerned about is the discourse of language or the fact that people speak to you, then you have to give in to a certain kind of linguistic empiricism, where you say the only reason why it is that people acquire language is because they've heard it and they've inherited it from the people around them. Wherein, to use this famous metaphor, or it becomes just as plausible to say, well, why is it that rocks don't learn a language, but people do, since rocks are also exposed to all the words that people say? There has to be some kind of biological component to the human mind that leads it to be able to generate human languages. And one of the things that I think Chomsky also stresses that's quite interesting is he says we sometimes overstate the historical variation between human beings for political purposes, when actually we all share a fundamental cognitive framework that's common to everyone. And he says, if you really want to think about how a cognitive being would be different, you can imagine something like an alien life form composed of silicon and the kind of language they might develop, right? We can translate human languages into one another because we more or less apprehend the world in the same way, and our minds generate similar languages. Whereas a silicon-based being would develop a language and have a concept of the world that might be so askew from the way we interpret it that Chomsky says we probably have to try to translate their language in the same way a lot of us try to deal with something like quantum mechanics, very incrementally, step by step, just by using empirical examples, really testing it, and so on. So I tend to buy into that criticism pretty firmly. And that's partly why I support his kind of rationalist outlook on these issues.
Yeah, so I don't know. Like I guess one thing I will say, and I think if I'm remembering, that Chomsky's probably gonna be guilty of this too later on, but just as just to do a little, pedantic point scoring, I will say that it seems like Chomsky did actually lay out pretty clearly, what he meant by human nature in his opening statement, and so I do find it slightly frustrating that that Foucault doesn't either say, yeah, okay, but that's not what we really mean in these discussions, or else, yeah, even in your sense, things are more complicated than you think, or something like that, right? Like it just sort of seemed like, I mean, maybe this was I don't know, maybe he'd already planned out what he was going to say initially, and this is like the equivalent of a canned opening statement in a sort of Oxford style debate. That's not a that's not directly responsive to the first person's opening statement yet. But I mean, I think that is just worth flagging.
I think it's interesting that that Chomsky leads with, and it comes back up, the notion of creativity. I mean, he's talking about within his linguistic paradigm, but it's funny because and I think actually like Foucault, there's a couple different versions of this in print with essays by Chomsky and Foucault, and I've read it a long time ago, this debate, and I've seen this a while ago, but because Foucault does say at one point, of course, like individuals, like children, have this creative spark when they're using language, but for Foucault, of course, the individual or the subject is always like is epiphenomenal of the discursive system in which he or she is is nurtured or is ensconced, and so it's interesting for him because, and this is where I think where Foucault sort of I agree with you, Matt, that he's a historian of science, mm-hmm. and Foucault primarily. And I think though what's interesting is that he comes to basically like for him, the idea, he might say, okay, yeah, there's a certain sense of creativity, but for him, like the individual, which is why it actually makes it so sort of frustrating in a way to translate this to politics, because I think that like for Foucault and the way that Foucault is taken up, that it usually is in the direction of an emancipatory politics, but it's almost always at the level of the individual who is trying to resist interpolation or to resist the various forms of power, like understood like softly through these various different sort of macro institutions, micro institutions as opposed to on the macro level. And what that does, I think, is it automatically leads him to be skeptical of any sort of claim about the subject or the individual. And he might like couch that in his response to Chomsky, like, well, I understand that in Chomsky's field where he's coming from, everything was considered predetermined and like there was no focus on the subject or the individual whatsoever. And so that's why Chomsky's contribution is so important. But I think like right off the bat for them to start with this notion of creativity, or for Chomsky to talk about that with regard to human nature is very interesting. I think that that's more amenable to a Marxist position than a Foucauldian one.
I should say, his linguistic theory stresses that very centrally. I can't remember, it was one of his 1970s books where he talks about the concept of semantic novelty, which is quite remarkable because he said it's quite likely that most sentences said by human beings are novel in the sense that they were never said before. And he says, there are obvious exceptions to that. Hello, goodbye, I'd like a beer, please. But if you think, the likelihood of somebody saying exactly what I'm saying right now, it's pretty implausible, right? And he says, this testifies to the fact that human beings are fundamentally creative, and that's demonstrated by the fact that we make incredibly novel use of the languages that we inherit, right?
So I was smiling just now because your three examples were when I was teaching at the University of Ulsan in South Korea, and those were, I think those were the three things I knew how to say in Korean.
The three essentials, right?
Yeah.
Hello, goodbye, need a beer, please.
What else do you need?
Yes, fair enough. All right, let's get a little further in.
Een aanwijzing voor een onderzoeksprogramma dan als een aanwijzing voor het feit dat de mens uit zichzelf zo verschrikkelijk veel klaar zou kunnen spelen. Voor hem is dat begrip menselijke natuur eigenlijk een soort van wetenschappelijk boodschappenlijstje en niet meer dan dat. En Chomsky wil dit wel accepteren als maar duidelijk is dat vakken als biologie, fysiologie en neurologie voorlopig nog helemaal niet over de middelen beschikken om die menselijke natuur en dat taalvermogen adequaat te kunnen beschrijven. Vrij vroeg is het debat zo aangeland op een punt waar het gespreksleider elders de grootste moeite zal kosten om de partners met elkaar in contact te houden. Voor een deel ligt het natuurlijk aan de taal die ze spreken, maar voor een veel groter deel ligt dat aan het feit dat Chomsky en Foucault ieder in een verschillende denkwereld zitten. Zodat we heel gemakkelijk langs elkaar heen glijden. We krijgen eigenlijk het merkwaardige schouwspel te zien van twee breinen die gelijktijdig aan het denken zijn. Om de beurt een begrip oppikken uit het betoog van de ander, om dit begrip dan vervolgens te belichten vanuit hun eigen denksysteem. Daarbij speelt dus voor Chomsky een grote rol dat begrip creativiteit, waarover nu een heel groot stuk van het debat zal gaan. Voor Chomsky is creativiteit eigenlijk een kenmerk van alle mensen. Iedereen werkt ermee. De verkeersdeelnemer, die ter plaatse in een onverwachte situatie moet gaan bedenken wat hij zal doen. De opvoeder, die niet terug wil vallen op autoritaire gedragspatronen en tegenover een lastige pupil zelf nieuw gedrag moet uitvinden. Maar vooral geldt deze creativiteit voor het kind dat een taal leert en dat daarbij merkwaardigerwijze leert om zelf nieuwe taal te produceren, te maken. Foucault staat daar tegenover. Hij vraagt voortdurend de aandacht voor het zogenoemde epistemologische veld waarbinnen de menselijke activiteit plaatsvindt. Dit epistemologische veld, oftewel episteme, wordt in het profiel omschreven als het geheel van niet bewuste regels die de algehele organisatie van onderling gescheiden velden van kennis beheersen. Foucault spreekt ook over tableau. Hij noemt het ook systeem van elementen. En in het debat valt ook het woord grille, tralie of rooster. We kunnen misschien het best spreken van een netwerk waarbinnen iedereen in een bepaalde cultuur denkt of hij wil of niet. Het zijn eigenlijk regels waaraan het denken van iedereen gehoorzaamt en met behulp waarvan iedereen zoekt naar bepaalde identiteiten, samenhangen enzovoort. En dit netwerk nu is niet de uitvinding van bepaalde individuen. Het bepaalt veel eer de regels van de denken- en doegewoonten, van het denken- en doegspel dat we cultuur noemen en waaraan ieder individu eigenlijk onderhorig is. Een dergelijk netwerk is ook geen ding of idee, maar het ligt precies tussen ding en idee in. En de geschiedenis van het denken is dan voor Foucault ook niet de geschiedenis van ideeën, of zelfs zoiets als de ontwikkeling van de geest of iets dergelijks, maar veel eer de afwisseling van discontinue transformaties, van discontinue overgangen van het ene netwerk naar het andere. Dat is dus een heel andere aanzet dan die van Chomsky, bij wie die creativiteit in het centrum staat. En het is duidelijk dat we op dit punt bij Foucault weer diezelfde onttroning van het subject tegenkomen, waarover we in verband met Galilei in het begin reeds gesproken hebben. De filosofie van Foucault is een filosofie waarbij de filosoof zelf eigenlijk voortdurend uit het beeld verdwijnt. Ja, paradoxaal genoeg zou je moeten zeggen, het is eigenlijk een filosofie zonder filosoof. En je moet dit ook nog generaliseren, want de mens is bij Foucault in zekere zin de grote afwezige in zijn eigen cultuur. En het is in dit verband dan ook heel begrijpelijk dat Foucault nogal fel en afwijzend reageert wanneer de gespreksleider belangstelling begint te vertonen voor privéaspecten van zijn bestaan. Wanneer Foucault debatteert, dan gaat het over alles, behalve over Foucault zelf. Dit dus ter introductie op dit volgende, vrij uitvoerige theoretische stuk van het debat, dat eigenlijk maar voortdurend allerlei aspecten van één hoofdvraag behandelt, en wel de vraag: in hoeverre is de mens in staat iets nieuws te ontdekken, en als dat zo is, hoe moeten we het dan begrijpen? Het lijkt mij een erg relevante vraag, zeker als we bedenken dat we nogal wat nieuwe vormen van gedrag, kennis en wetenschap nodig zullen hebben, willen we het er in onze wereld met elkaar levend afbrengen. We nemen nu de draad weer op waar Foucault toelicht waarom hij aan de creativiteit van het individu in de geschiedenis niet zoveel aandacht besteedt.
Dans l'histoire traditionnelle des sciences, on accorde en effet le maximum, la tradition veut qu'on accorde le maximum à la créativité des individus. L'histoire des sciences, jusqu'à ces dernières années, consistait essentiellement à montrer en quoi un individu, que ce soit Newton ou que ce soit Mendel, peu importe, avait été effectivement le créateur ou le découvreur plutôt d'une vérité qui était là, inscrite dans les choses et dans le monde, et que personne avant eux n'aurait vu. Le postulat qu'il y a, je crois, qui dort en quelque sorte sous l'histoire des sciences traditionnelles, c'est ceci, c'est que la vérité est là pour être connue et que pourtant l'esprit de l'homme, par la suite, par l'effet d'un certain nombre d'inhibitions ou d'obstacles, n'est pas parvenu à voir cette vérité. L'esprit de l'homme est fait pour voir la vérité et un obstacle contingent l'en empêche. Cet obstacle, ça peut être, eh bien, selon les historiens, les conditions économiques et sociales, ou ça peut être la forme des mentalités, ou ça peut être la crédulité, les vieux thèmes et mythes religieux, par exemple, ou moraux. Enfin, tout ceci constitue comme les
sounds like somebody's got some phone notifications coming in. If you could just mute that.
Est fait pour voir. En droit, l'esprit est fait pour avoir accès à la vérité. Dans cette conception traditionnelle de l'histoire des sciences, d'une part, si vous voulez, on donne toute la créativité à l'individu, qui est en droit possesseur de la vérité, et puis on la lui retire par le système des obstacles qui viennent d'une façon tout à fait contingente l'empêcher de saisir, de formuler, de construire cette vérité à laquelle il a droit en principe. Bon. Alors, moi, le problème qui s'est posé à moi, c'était précisément un peu l'inverse. Parce que qu'est-ce qui se passe quand on assiste à une grande transformation scientifique? Dans une transformation scientifique, comme par exemple la naissance de la biologie au milieu du XVIIe siècle, ou la naissance de la philologie à la fin du XVIIIe, au début du XIXe. C'est vrai qu'un certain nombre d'obstacles, un certain nombre de préjugés, un certain nombre d'idées toutes faites tombent et viennent à disparaître. Mais ce qui m'a frappé, c'est qu'une science, au moment où elle naît, non seulement se débarrasse d'un certain nombre d'obstacles et d'obscurités, mais en même temps, elle supprime un certain nombre de savoirs et de connaissances existantes qu'elle occulte, qu'elle cache, comme si elle appliquait une grille nouvelle qui, tout en permettant de faire apparaître des phénomènes jusque-là cachés, cache des connaissances déjà acquises. Donc, une science, le progrès d'une science, l'acquisition d'une science, ce n'est pas simplement l'oubli des vieux préjugés, ce ne sont pas simplement les obstacles qui tombent, c'est une véritable nouvelle grille qui cache un certain nombre de choses et du coup fait apparaître. Donc, quand je critique la notion de créativité, je veux dire par là que, en fait, la vérité ne s'acquiert pas comme une sorte de création continue et cumulée, mais comme un jeu de grilles qui s'appliquent les unes sur les autres, cachées.
I think in part we're slightly talking in cross purposes because of a different use of the term creativity. In fact, I should say that my use of the term creativity is a little bit idiosyncratic, and therefore the onus falls on me, not on you in this case. But when I speak of creativity, I'm not attributing to the concept the notion of value that is normal when we speak of creativity. That is, when you speak of scientific creativity, you're speaking properly of the achievements of a Newton. But in the context in which I've been speaking about creativity, it's a normal human event. I'm speaking of the kind of creativity that any child demonstrates when he is able to come to grips with a new situation, describe it properly, react to it properly, tell us something about it, think about it in a new fashion for him, and so on. These are, I think it's appropriate to call those creative acts, but of course without thinking of those acts as being the acts of a Newton. It's the lower levels of creativity that I've been speaking of. Now, as far as what you say about the history of science is concerned, I think that's correct and illuminating, and particularly relevant, in fact, to the kinds of enterprise that I see lying before us in psychology and linguistics and the philosophy of mind. That is, I think there are certain topics that have been, what was your word, depressed or put aside during the scientific advances of the, say, past 2 centuries, century and a half. But now I think we can overcome those, or it's possible to put aside those limitations and forgettings and to bring into our consideration precisely the topics that animated a good deal of the thinking and speculation of the 17th and 18th century, and to incorporate it within a much broader and I think deeper science of man that will give fuller role, though certainly not will not hope to give complete understanding to such notions as innovation and creativity and freedom and production of new new elements of thought and behavior within some system of rule and schematism. Those are concepts that I think we can come to grips with.
Je crois qu'entre ce qu'a dit M. Chomsky à l'instant et puis ce que j'essaie de montrer, il y a en réalité beaucoup de ressemblances. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a en fait de création possible, d'innovation possible. On ne peut, dans l'ordre du langage ou dans l'ordre du savoir, produire quelque chose de nouveau qu'en mettant en jeu un certain nombre de règles qui vont définir l'acceptabilité ou la grammaticalité des énoncés, ou qui va définir, dans le cas du savoir, la scientificité des énoncés. Alors, disons en gros que les linguistes, avant M. Chomsky, ont surtout insisté sur les règles de construction des énoncés et moins sur l'innovation que représente tout énoncé nouveau ou l'audition d'un énoncé nouveau. Et puis, dans l'histoire des sciences ou dans l'histoire de la pensée, on avait beaucoup plus l'habitude d'insister sur la création individuelle et on avait tenu à l'écart, on avait laissé dans l'ombre ces espèces de règles communes, générales, qui sont en œuvre obscurément à travers toute découverte scientifique, toute invention scientifique, ou même d'ailleurs toute innovation philosophique. Des règles non seulement linguistiques, mais épistémologiques, et qui caractérisent le savoir contemporain.
Well, I think perhaps I can try to react to those comments within my own framework in a way which maybe will shed some light on this. How is it that we're able to construct any kind of scientific theory at all? How is it that given a small amount of data, it's possible for various scientists, for various geniuses even over a long period of time, to arrive at some kind of a theory, at least in some cases, that is more or less profound and more or less empirically adequate? This is a remarkable fact. And in fact, if it were not the case that these scientists, including the geniuses, if they didn't have built into their minds somehow, obviously unconscious, specification of what is a possible scientific theory, then this inductive leap would certainly be quite impossible. Just as if each child did not have built into his mind the concept of human language in a very natural way, in a very narrowing way, then the inductive leap from data to knowledge of a language would be impossible. So even though the process of, let's say, deriving knowledge of physics from data is far more complex, far more difficult for us, for organisms such as us, far more drawn out in time, requires intervention of genius and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, in a certain sense, the achievement of discovering physical science or biology or whatever you like is based on something rather similar to the achievement of the normal child in discovering the structure of his language. That is, it must be achieved on the basis of an initial limitation, an initial restriction on the class of possible theories. And the fact that science converges and progresses, that itself shows us that such initial limitations and structures exist. That is, I don't think that scientific progress is simply a matter of a cumulative addition of new knowledge and absorption of new theories and so on. Rather, I think it has this sort of jagged pattern that you described, forgetting certain problems and leaping to new theories and so on and so forth.
Et transformant les mêmes connaissances.
Right. But I think that the explanation for that, so I think one can perhaps hazard an explanation for that fact. And oversimplifying grossly, I really don't mean what I'm now going to say literally. It's as if, as human beings, a particular biologically given organism, we have in our heads, to start with, a certain set of possible intellectual structures, possible sciences, okay? Now, in the lucky event that some aspect of reality happens to have the character of one of these structures in our mind, then we have a science. And it's because of this limitation, initial limitation in our minds to a certain kind of possible science, it's precisely that that provides the tremendous richness and creativity of scientific knowledge. That is, if it were not, it's important to stress that. This has to do with your point about limitations. If it were not for these limitations, we would not have the creative act of going from a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, to a rich and highly articulated and complicated array of knowledge. It's precisely because of that that the progress of science, I think, has the erratic and jagged and transformational character that you describe. And that doesn't mean that everything is ultimately going to fall within the domain of science. Quite the contrary. Personally, I believe that many of the things we would like to understand, and maybe the things we would most like to understand, such as the nature of man or the nature of a decent society or lots of other things might really be outside the scope of possible human sciences.
Well, I think we have now two questions out of this statement. One question is if you can agree, Mr. Foucault, do you agree with the statement about a combination of limitation?
I have a question for you, Ben, actually, because again, as I mentioned, Chomsky makes no bones about the fact that he situates himself in the broadly Enlightenment tradition, particularly the mature Enlightenment of figures like Humboldt. But he's variably described his linguistics and his conception of human nature as Cartesian and Kantian, Humboldtian. I think that certainly the way he's articulating it here, it seems extraordinarily Kantian in his connotations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Descartes here.
Yeah, exactly, right. But the notion that there are certain fundamental conditions for the human understanding of the phenomenal world that exist cognitively within us a priori, and that without those kind of conditions, we wouldn't be able to understand one another, let alone expand the world outside of us. But these limitations can never be firmly overcome. And in fact, a lot of the things that we'd like to say about reality in and of itself are precluded by the same limitations that make possible creative acts of rationalization when it comes to the world. Would you say that that seems right?
Like as a description for his view?
Yeah, well, this is kind of what I might call the Kantian interpretation of Chomsky's view.
I mean, like I said, that's certainly how he seems to be expressing it, like right now in this debate.
Yeah, because I've never quite understood why he characterizes his linguistics at times as Cartesian, except for the idea that there's kind of these built-in structures, right?
Yeah, it was his first book, I think, right? The Cartesian linguistics. But yeah, you were going to say, Russell?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I totally agree with that. Earlier I said I distinguish between Foucault as an epistemologist and Chomsky as an empiricist, but here clearly I think that it is a Kantian frame because it does. I thought the same exact thing, that it's like a priori structures of mind, and so in that regard of his argument, it would, in the Kantian sense of the term, it would be much more rationalist, right? So my suspicion, which is not based on having done any kind of deep dive into Chomsky linguistics, but like from what I know about it, my suspicion is that probably it really did start out like, okay, maybe he was using Cartesian to just sort of dramatically underline the point. It was always like this, but my suspicion is that it might have started out with like a little, it might have started out more Cartesian and less Kantian than this, like as he sort of started to like think harder about and like narrow, make more precise his theory of what exactly these innate linguistic structures are, probably got a bit more Kantian. I'd say also on the empiricism issue. So, I mean, if you think like the sort of like intro to philosophy kind of definition of empiricism, that all right, the rationalist thinks that some of our knowledge is some of our substantive knowledge is a priori, right? Everybody thinks that our knowledge, there are some trivial things that our knowledge of just comes from definitions and logic, but that all of our substantive knowledge, is empirical. It only comes from external evidence. Then yeah, I mean, he's certainly not that, and I think never was. But I guess a couple things I'd say about that are that I think actually, like, the more you read about like the British empiricists, like the less clear it is that any of them really fit that definition. Yeah. Like I certainly don't think Hume was an empiricist in that sense. No. Yeah, right.
Even Locke's account of the self is really dependent upon memory, right? So it's kind of hard to make the argument that he'd be a strict empirical realist in the sense of Stephen Hicks today, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, in fact, with Hume, certainly, like, his. I mean, people oftentimes, like, in this weird way, right? They talk about him like he's a skeptic, about knowledge, and of course, he's nothing of the kind. If you read the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he says, after pointing out all these problems with like explaining how we can, have evidence-based knowledge of various things, that only a fool or a madman, would deny that we actually do, that those things are true, which certainly suggests to me that he has some sort of underlying view that, that there's that there is some, that there is some sort of externalist sense, in which we become aware of these things that, sure, we can't replicate the reasoning, but that doesn't actually mean that, we don't know perfectly well that, an external world exists and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of, I think it's in the Inquiry where he's talking about, the philosopher Stanley Cavell talks about this a lot. I think it's in The Claim of Reason, or maybe it must we mean what we say, but at one point Hume is talking about where he's basically laid out the position of skepticism, the skeptical position. And then he says, but, then it actually makes him melancholy. And then I go out and I shoot pool with my friends, and you can't live your skepticism. And so that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, where like theory and application, the theory sort of falls apart because we betray, even if you're a skeptic, you betray it with your actions all the time by going out and acting that as if there are other people and there's an external world and it exists. And that as if is actually crucial because when you act that way, it brings this into play. But Ben, I think your point about that Hume isn't a skeptic is really interesting, because it would go right, like Locke empiricist, Hume skeptic, Berkeley idealist. And I think that line between like skepticism and idealism, like Berkeley and idealism is a form of skepticism that you don't get in Hume. And so I think that was a really crucial clarification there. But then I was also thinking about, with regard to bring it back to the debate, it's interesting that Chomsky here articulates a sort of Kantian notion of I don't know, philosophy of mind in a way, because of course, like one of Foucault's most anthologized pieces is what Enlightenment, responding to Kant, and that's something that Foucault is very much trying to, in the sort of post-structuralist vein, to sort of unravel or deconstruct it in a way. And so that's, I think, like, in order to see the differences between the two, because in that last sort of clip we watched, or the last sort of 10 minutes or so, there was a lot of agreement. And so to see the disagreement between them, you kind of have to approach it sort of like obliquely, but it's there, right?
Well, I actually had a more general question. Maybe Russell, you'd want to chime in on this, and then Ben here, because I think Russell probably has some pretty developed thoughts on it. But you hear like Foucault articulate this fundamentally kind of Kuhnian approach to science, right? Which is that we shouldn't see it in this teleological fashion as the progression of empirical knowledge, which is then theoretized by genius. There are ruptures, there are breaks, and we're always kind of wearing glasses that are historically and socially determined, that frame our understanding of the empirical world. You can call them paradigms or discourse or whatever it is that you want.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of interested in why it is that a lot of people on the political left are attracted to these understandings of the history of scientific thought. Because, and I mean, certainly there are some people on the political left who are quite hostile to them, so I don't want to generalize too broadly, right? But, a lot of people in grad school that I went to consider themselves radicals. This is the kind of stock approach to the history of science that they took. So do you have any thoughts on why it is that this seems to have a kind of almost visceral appeal?
Well, it's a good question. I think frankly that especially within academic philosophy, I mean, there is philosophy that's non-academic, but I just think outside of philosophy, like in the academy, I think that we are a good friend of mine, Anna Kornblue, is actually working on a book about this, but we are far more adept at critique than something constructive. And I think that I'm sort of staunchly against these the sort of nascent, or I guess it's not really nascent, it's with us now. I mean, especially in literary studies and maybe a little bit in political theory, but this notion of sort of post-critique and post-criticism. Yeah. And I'm firmly against that. I think we need to remain committed to the critique of ideology, but there is a sense in which the notion of the political and what's possible has been so attenuated and so it's so strained, or just like we don't have the resources to think about it now, that it's sort of I think it's comforting to actually like think that the critique itself is enough. as opposed to articulating a broader vision. And I think that's where like Chomsky, I think, is stronger than Foucault, because Foucault's is really a politics. I think it kind of speaks, I mean, maybe this addresses your question, Matt, but I think that very much so, like liberal left is, everything is still very much a politics of resistance. And that, I think, is what, without trivializing Foucault's contribution, I think that Foucaultianism is primarily a philosophy or a project of resistance, as opposed to, which is why like a lot of political theory that comes out of Foucault is, power is something that is inherently tainted, inherently bad. And so there's no sort of redeeming of power. And so if power is something that is to be avoided, then all you can do is have these sort of gestures of critique where you keep looking at these different levels of society in which power is, there's power invested in it, but even it might not be manifestly, right?
Yeah, and this, by the way, like is one of the things I think it's go back to one of the first things you said at the beginning, is I think one of the worst, influences of Foucault on certainly academic leftists, because it's one of these things. It's like if everybody's guilty, nobody's guilty. Like if everything is some kind of power relation, then like you're really obscuring like the sort of fundamental institutional things that the left as a left would naturally focus on. It's like Noah Berlatsky saying that like parents are an oppressor class. Like white people or rich people. It's kind of that. Obviously, like not all of it's like silly on that level, but this, thinking like seeing any kind of like anything that has any kind of like power differential anywhere in the neighborhood of it as being basically the same thing as the kind of structures of legal inequality or economic exploitation that that the socialists would traditionally be concerned with. I think is a huge problem politically, for a lot of the contemporary academic left, and that however genuinely insightful he was about lots of things, Foucault definitely does have some of the responsibility for that.
Well, I just want to chime in there by saying I 100% think that his criticism of the kind of teleological understanding of science that people sometimes put forward in the early Enlightenment was very well founded. Yeah. I also really kind of appreciate the fact that he pointed out that oftentimes appeals to science, or scientism at the least, have been used to justify all kinds of atrocities and all kinds of very malignant forms of power. I mean, I'm reading a book about Nazi Germany right now, and the examples in that are just replete when it came to things like eugenics and so on and so forth. On the other hand, right, I do think that he bears some culpability for the kind of cheesy hyper-relativism that you sometimes see on the political left right now. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but just as a kind of rhetorical point, when people, and Ben made this point actually in his first book, Give Them an Argument, right? When people see left-wing theorists saying things like, no, A does not equal A, or 2 + 2 does not have to equal 4 because that's just a kind of imposition, I don't think it's a particularly good look for us to wear.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think, and actually, I do want to try to directly answer the question you asked earlier about why these kinds of relativist or quasi-relativist views about science, seem to have a visceral appeal for some contemporary leftists. Contemporary, by the way, is a key word there, because
I should say Foucault's account is a lot more sophisticated. I'd even say than Kuhn's account in Structure of Scientific Religion.
Yeah, as much as
so I'm not trying to say that he's to blame for all of his self-appointed disciples.
As much as in this debate, it's the same way Chomsky's version of his rationalist linguistic sounds like sounds like Kantian metaphysics here. The Foucault's explanation of his views in science here sounds super Kuhnian, but yeah, look. So again, contemporary is an important qualification, because who wasn't like remotely attracted to any sort of epistemic relativism about science? Karl Marx. If anything, it's like what little Marx and Engels say about this is kind of like naive realist. That material. That we know exactly. That obviously can sometimes be hard to find out, but that there is clearly something called material reality, and there's a fact of the matter of it, and it's waiting for us to find out. But then I think when it comes to contemporary leftists who oftentimes are attracted to these sort of quasi-relativist views about science, I have at least two possible answers, one of which is a little mean and one of which is more charitable. So the first one is just that that leftists, so many of whom are academics, because there's a deep sense in which, like Adolf Reed, talks about, that we sort of don't have a left right now in the United States. That if by left you mean the sort of thing that's existed in other societies, in the 20th century, that has this kind of social weight within the working class and can act politically in certain ways and all that. We don't really have that. We have left media, we have left intellectuals. We have some kind of activist organizations, but none of it quite adds up to the same thing. And so many leftists, aren't those Gramscian organic intellectuals. They come out of academia. Which whatever. All three of us do. Cards on the table, and frankly, I think academic leftists are way more likely to come out, be like film studies majors than physics majors. And so I think that some of it's just kind of, I don't know, some of this stuff really is as simple as just being kind of like intellectual penis envy or something. That's like, that's like we have it, like, it's like, oh, you don't want to, like you want to take the hard sciences down a notch. That's the uncharitable interpretation. The more charitable interpretation, and somebody in the chat, I think, put their finger on this really nicely, has to do with one of the big themes of our departed friend Michael Brooks's excellent book Against the Web, which is that when it comes to historical analysis, of political structures, economics, relations between the genders, all that stuff, right? That one of the big fundamental distinctions between leftism and reactionary thought is that reactionaries tend to either naturalize or mythologize. In other words, to either attribute things to just biology, like even lobsters have hierarchy, that sort of bullshit, and or mythologize. That'll be naturalizing, or the mythologizing version would be talking about. Stick with the same reactionary, right? Talking about the dragon of chaos or whatever, right? That we need to have the traditional social order to keep that at bay. Whereas
I was going to say Peterson does both. That's the nice thing about it.
Yeah.
Right?
Peterson has a rare facility for sliding back and forth between the two versions of reactionary analysis. Whereas the left, when it's talking about subjects like that, naturally and appropriately historicizes, right? We say no. These things are historically contingent. That society happens to be organized this way, but there's no reason it couldn't be. But that arose under certain specific conditions, and it could go out of existence under other conditions. It's it doesn't have to be that way. Really, as simple as it is, what I just said kind of is the core of what it is to be a leftist, is to think that about social structures. And so I think that given that, it could be the case that some leftists, with the best intentions of the world, might sort of over-apply that insight, right? And sort of say, okay, well, we tend to, when we're thinking about politics, we tend to historicize rather than naturalizing. So then they just sort of go nuts applying that same instinct everywhere else, when it might not make equal amounts of sense in every domain.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Michael's book, because when I first read it, part of me was like, there is a Foucauldian strain in there of historicization, because in the field of literary studies, like historicism came out of Foucault, and I think that the work that Foucault's, version of form of historicization is extremely important. But when it goes too far, and I think it might be this debate, but you'll notice that whenever you try to translate that into politics, it translates into a skepticism of, or a reticence to have a sort of political program, again, other than kind of resisting power. Because I think what happens is that at some point, like Foucault's historicism is much more applicable to, for like an ethics than a politics. And I think that he becomes skeptical, like, well, because we don't know, there is no fundamental human nature. We don't know what the next, episteme is going to be, that we are sort of inhibiting, future man or whatever, or there are types of discursive forms of power that we haven't taken into account yet. And so power is always the enemy. And so I think that really hamstrings you in a way. You can't come up with a positive, concrete political vision, which of course is the opposite of what you get in, I think it's the last chapter of Michael's book. And so, yeah, I think, like, Ben, you were basically saying the same thing that I just said, but I wanted to sort of follow up on and elaborate on it a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think that ties into what I was trying to express earlier about everything is power, because if everything is power, and you go into this like microscopic detail of like human interactions and power differentials in them, then okay, no possible human society would get rid of all of that, like that we're just stuck with it. So in a way, like, you end up becoming a concern. I mean, look, it's one of the major tenets of the conservative intellectual tradition. It's the futility thesis. So no matter how radical your original intentions, I think the effect of that can be kind of conservative. I think that the way that Michael threads the needle in that last chapter of Against the Web is exactly right. And I know from many conversations with him, is the part of the book that was the most important to him, that sort of saying, look, I don't want to dismiss concern with cultural issues as some sort of, just like a silly distraction or something. Obviously, this is where people spend their lives. This is important that we have something to say about it. But you also don't want to you don't want to go with a version of leftism that where you end up seeming like you're just this insufferable hall monitor of every petty interaction. It's like, you can't make that dish, that's cultural appropriation, like that. So I think that the way I don't want to get us too far off track. Obviously, we've got a long way to go in the debate, and we need to get back to it. But I think that there's a vision there that's really valuable about how we can tie together economic leftism with a vision of the world, and how people can live together in it, that human beings would actually find appealing.
Well, you can denaturalize and demythologize and still have a positive political vision. That's what I think is that we need to. That's something that we need to. That's a point we need to make more forcefully.
For sure.
I also wanted to give Foucault props because while the language of reason and enlightenment originally was a highly emancipatory one, what he explores, I think, with great genius in a lot of his works, is precisely how it was that this language could become calcified and used to justify various reactionary positions. Right, and imagine were Foucault alive today, he would have just lacerating things to say about the IDW, and precisely how it is that they use the language and rhetoric of reason, strip it from its kind of radical enlightenment core in order to justify, naturalize, or mythologize, to use Ben's language, various far-right positions. And you see these speakers do that all the time, whether you're talking about Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, or Dave Rubin, right? Kind of turning the weapons of the radical enlightenment against it.
Yeah, well, speaking of Dave Rubin, let's get back to the high level ideas. Arguably maybe even higher level than those. So I am going to at some point, by the way, in the next few minutes, I'm probably gonna have to turn off my camera for a minute. I'll still be able to hear everything, but I won't be able to pause until I get back, just as a heads up. But let's get going back with the debate.
Il n'y a de créativité possible qu'à partir d'un système de règles. Ce n'est pas un mélange de régularité et de liberté. Une liberté ne s'exerce réellement que sur fond et à partir d'un réseau de régularité. Le problème, alors là, que je me pose, et où je ne suis pas peut-être tout à fait d'accord avec M. Chomsky, c'est lorsqu'il place ces régularités à l'intérieur, en quelque sorte, de l'esprit ou de la nature humaine. Je me demande si le système de régularité, de contraintes qui rendent possible une science, on ne peut pas les trouver ailleurs, en dehors même de l'esprit humain, dans des formes sociales, dans des rapports de production, dans des luttes de classe, etc.
Mais quand même, qu'est-ce que la raison pour vous de parler de temps en temps de la mort de l'homme ou du fin de la période 19e, 20e siècle, n'est-ce pas?
Mais ça n'a pas de rapport avec ce que nous disons. Là.
Ah, je ne sais pas, parce que je pense à... quand vous... Je traite d'appliquer, qu'est-ce que vous avez dit, à votre notion anthropologique. Vous avez refusé déjà de parler sur votre propre créativité et liberté, n'est-ce pas? Alors, qu'est-ce qu'elle a raison? Quelles sont les raisons psychologiques, je me demande, mais quelles sont peut-être...
vous le demandez, mais moi je
mais quelles sont les raisons, laissons-nous dire, plus objectives peut-être pour vous, votre conception de savoir, de la connaissance, de la science, pour refuser de répondre à des questions personnelles, n'est-ce pas? Ça a à faire quelque chose avec votre conception de la société. Alors, quand il y a un problème ici pour vous, qu'est-ce que sont les raisons de faire un problème d'une question personnelle?
Non, je ne fais pas du tout un problème d'une question personnelle, je fais d'une question personnelle une absence de problème. C'est-à-dire que dans toute l'histoire traditionnelle de la pensée, des idées et des sciences, on s'est toujours posé le problème de savoir à quel âge Newton avait dû être sevré pour concevoir la gravitation universelle. À quelle époque est-ce que Cuvier avait rencontré sa première maîtresse pour pouvoir finalement découvrir les fossiles, l'anatomie comparée, etc. Ce genre d'analyse, enfin que je caricature, ce genre d'analyse est, je crois, sans intérêt. Il est beaucoup plus intéressant de saisir les transformations d'un savoir en général à l'intérieur à la fois du domaine général des sciences et également de ce domaine en quelque sorte vertical que constitue une société, une culture, une civilisation à un moment donné. Et quand on saisit l'ensemble de la transformation, à ce moment-là, eh bien, on s'aperçoit que les petits événements individuels de la vie du savant n'est pas important.
Opnieuw verdwijnt in deze laatste opmerking van Foucault het individuele leven van de geleerde onderzoeker uit het beeld. Maar hoe zit het dan met de verhouding van de mens tot zijn cultuur als het gaat over de politiek en misschien zelfs over de vraag hoe je die cultuur en die maatschappij kunt veranderen? Immers, men kan wel laten zien dat in de geschiedenis van de wetenschappen, in de geschiedenis van de cultuur, de inbreng van het individu een vrijwel te verwaarlozen rol speelt. De vraag, hoe moet ik handelen, de politieke vraag, blijft desalniettemin recht overeind staan. En het zal na het voorgaande misschien al duidelijk zijn dat die politieke vraag in het perspectief van Foucault heel sterk wordt tot de vraag: in hoeverre kan de mens ontsnappen aan zijn eigen cultuur? Daarbij is het wel van belang om op te merken dat Foucault zich helemaal niet wil distancieren van de politiek. Integendeel, hij zegt ergens: wat zou ik ideologisch verblind moeten zijn om me niet te interesseren voor datgene wat het meest wezenlijke is in het menselijk bestaan. Economische verhoudingen, machtsverhoudingen en noem maar op. Chomsky en Foucault zijn het dus wel eens over het belang van de politieke vraagstelling. Het is misschien ook wel informatief om nog eventjes uitdrukkelijk te zeggen dat Chomsky zijn politieke standpunt betitelt als anarcho-syndicalisme. Hij is van mening dat het noodzakelijk is de verschillende vormen van kapitalisme op te heffen en te doorbreken ten bate van de directe participatie van de arbeider in arbeidersraden enzovoort. Decentralisatie, socialisatie en participatie, het zijn sleutelwoorden in het politiek programma van Chomsky. Chomsky zegt weliswaar dat hij geen noodzakelijk verband ziet tussen zijn wetenschappelijke inzichten en zijn politieke, maar uit de nu volgende openingsset blijkt dat hij regelrecht vanuit zijn wetenschappelijke opvattingen afstevend op de politiek. Zijn politieke en wetenschappelijke inzichten mogen niet logisch uit elkaar voortvloeien, ze lopen wel degelijk parallel.
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then of course it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge, that I think is intrinsic to human nature, will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
Je suis dans ma démarche beaucoup moins avancée, je vais beaucoup moins loin que M. Chomsky, c'est-à-dire que j'avoue n'être pas capable de définir, il n'y a plus forte raison de proposer un modèle de fonctionnement social idéal pour notre société scientifique ou technologique. En revanche, une des tâches qui me paraît urgente, immédiate, avant même toute autre chose, c'est celle-ci. On a l'habitude, du moins dans notre société européenne, de considérer que le pouvoir, il est localisé entre les mains du gouvernement et il s'exerce par un certain nombre d'institutions bien particulières qui sont l'administration, en France on appelle ça préfectorale, enfin, je ne sais pas comment on dit ailleurs, l'administration, la police, l'armée. On sait que toutes ces institutions-là sont faites pour transmettre les ordres, les faire appliquer et punir les gens qui n'obéissent pas. Mais je crois que le pouvoir politique, il s'exerce encore, il s'exerce en outre, de plus, par l'intermédiaire d'un certain nombre d'institutions qui ont l'air comme ça de n'avoir rien de commun avec le pouvoir politique, qui ont l'air d'en être indépendantes et qui ne le sont pas. On sait bien que l'université, d'une façon générale, tout le système scolaire, qui en apparence est fait simplement pour distribuer le savoir, on sait que cet appareil scolaire est fait pour maintenir au pouvoir une certaine classe sociale et exclure des instruments du pouvoir toute une autre classe sociale. Quelque chose comme la psychiatrie, qui en apparence aussi n'est destinée qu'au bien de l'humanité et à la connaissance des psychiatres, la psychiatrie est encore une certaine manière de faire peser un pouvoir politique sur un groupe social. La justice également. Bon, et il me semble que la tâche politique actuelle dans une société comme la nôtre, c'est de critiquer le jeu des institutions apparemment les plus neutres et les plus indépendantes, de les critiquer, de l'attaquer de telle manière que la violence politique qui s'exerçait obscurément en eux surgisse et pour qu'on puisse lutter contre elle. À vouloir tout de suite, enfin si on cherche tout de suite à donner le profil et la formule de la société future sans avoir bien fait la critique de tous les rapports de violence politique qui s'exercent dans notre société, on risque de les laisser se reconstituer, même à travers des formes aussi nobles, apparemment aussi pures que celles du syndicalisme anarchiste.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, not only in theory, but also in action. That is, there are two intellectual tasks. One, and the one which I was discussing, to try to create the vision of a future just society. Another task is to understand very clearly the nature of power and oppression and terror and destruction in our own society. And that certainly includes the institutions you mentioned, as well as the central institutions of any industrial society, namely the economic, commercial, and financial institutions, in particular, in the coming period, the great multinational corporations, which are not very far from us physically tonight. Those are the basic institutions of oppression and coercion and autocratic rule that appear to be neutral. After all, they say, well, we're subject to the democracy of the marketplace. Still, I think it would be a great shame to lose or to put aside entirely the somewhat more abstract and philosophical, if you like, task of trying to draw the connections between a concept of human nature that gives full scope to freedom and dignity and creativity and other fundamental human characteristics, and relates that to some notion of social structure in which those properties could be realized, in which meaningful human life could take place. And in fact, if we are thinking of social transformation or social revolution, though it would be absurd, of course, to try to draw out in detail the point that we're hoping to reach, still we should know something about where we think we're going. And such a theory may tell it to us.
Oui, mais alors là, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un danger? Si on dit que il existe une certaine nature humaine, que cette nature humaine n'a pas reçu dans la société actuelle les droits et les possibilités qui lui permettraient de se réaliser. C'est bien ce que vous avez dit, je crois. Et si on admet cela, est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de définir cette nature humaine à la fois idéale et réelle, cette nature humaine cachée et réprimée jusqu'à présent, est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de la définir dans des termes que nous empruntons à notre société, à notre civilisation, à notre culture? Je vais prendre un exemple qui est un peu caricatural, mais le marxisme d'une certaine époque, à la fin du 19e, au début du 20e siècle, le marxisme admettait en effet que dans la société capitaliste, l'homme ne recevait pas toutes ses possibilités de développement et de réalisation, que la nature humaine était effectivement aliénée dans le système capitaliste. Et le marxisme rêvait d'une nature humaine enfin libérée. Or, cette nature humaine, quel modèle utilisait-il le marxisme de cette époque-là, du 19e, du début du 20e siècle, quel modèle utilisait-il pour la concevoir, pour la rêver? C'était en réalité le modèle bourgeois. Le marxisme a considéré qu'une société heureuse, c'était une société qui faisait place, par exemple, à une sexualité de type bourgeois, à une famille de type bourgeois, à une esthétique de type bourgeois. Et c'est d'ailleurs tellement vrai que c'est comme ça que ça s'est passé en Union soviétique, où sous prétexte de réaliser une société où l'homme réaliserait enfin sa nature, on a reconstitué une espèce de société à la fois réelle et utopique qui est transposée de la société bourgeoise du 19e siècle. De sorte que, est-ce que la notion de nature humaine vous-même, en commençant, vous reconnaissiez, je crois qu'on ne savait pas très bien ce que c'était que cette nature humaine. Alors, est-ce qu'il ne risque pas de nous induire en erreur? Vous savez que Mao Tse-tung parlait de nature humaine bourgeoise et de nature humaine prolétarienne, et il considère que ce n'est pas la même chose.
Well, that seems like a good place to stop and get some thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to say that, like, in terms of analyses of power and the various forms that power can take, I think there's no denying that Foucault was a lot more creative, expansive, and original than Chomsky was. And I mean, it's what he's known for, so it'd be kind of disappointing if he wasn't, right? I do think, though, that the kind of point he made at the end about the risk and the dangers of getting it wrong kind of testified to the limitations of his approach overall. And again, even fans of Foucault will attest to this. That sometimes the centrality of power in this analysis can become so overwhelming that first off, it becomes almost impossible to conceive of a situation where there could be what he sometimes calls productive relations of power. And on the other hand, it's very difficult to conceive of how it is that you could generalize into a society where there are primarily productive rather than disciplinary or biopolitical forms that power can take, right? And this can really just be kind of a downer at the end of the day, right? Where you sit there kind of like Foucault is doing, saying, well, there's so many risks that are involved in even trying to start such a project that's maybe it's better for us to just limit ourselves to critique. And while I acknowledge that there are a huge amount of risks that you take, and he spelled out some of them, I think, quite eloquently, I think the risks of not actually trying to conceive of a better society in line with what Chomsky is talking about are a lot graver, because that can lead us to just complying to the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would mostly agree with that. I think that it's hard. I think that it is to a certain degree a reductive view of Marxism, but I think that one can accept his point, right? Okay, let's take it for granted. Let's grant that the Marxist notion of human nature is a bourgeois notion, because Marx was theorizing this in a bourgeois era, right? That's essentially his point, right? You can't get outside of the particular episteme in which you exist. But and I actually think like that his critique of the concept of human nature, you could accept that too, right? I mean, human nature seems to be something that is almost always in excess of itself. I mean, if you think about what's happening in biogenetics, like 300, 400 years from now, if we're still here, I mean, we won't be here, but I mean, if human beings are still here, you know, what constitutes the human being, or what is an innate attribute of the human being could change. But I don't see, I think that the danger of sort of doing nothing, and I'm not even Foucault is not saying to do nothing, right? I want to give Foucault his due, but the danger of, well, 100 years from now, we may have a different definition of what human nature is. Okay, well, at least for that 100 years or so, until things have transformed, we've mitigated a certain amount of immiseration in the world, of human suffering. And so this, I think, is why, I said at the outset, like, philosophically and theoretically, I actually find a lot of what Foucault says sound and can agree with. And then I'm left to ask, okay, so what is a radical emancipatory politics? And I don't find that in Foucault. And that's why, even though Chomsky, I have a lot of disagreement. So like Chomsky, there was this big spat between Chomsky and Zizek, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now or something. But Chomsky has a history of like sort of dismissing a number of continental thinkers, like Lacan as a charlatan. He basically said the same thing about Zizek. And I mean, it's clear to me what side I stand. I stand with Zizek, but I think that politically, and I don't consider myself an anarcho-syndicalist. I consider myself a communist, but because I think that the state should play a large role in the sort of future society. But
yeah.
No,
I want to jump in on that, but finish your thought.
Okay, no, I was just gonna say, like, but politically, it's if you give me a choice between the two, it's not a question. Whatever reservations I have, I would go with Chomsky.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, actually, so if anything, on the actual political upshot question here, should we try to imagine a better society? I think I'm like. I mean, I think that my critique of Chomsky is that he's not being Chomskyan enough, that like that not only do I mean, I think that, I think that Karl Marx is right about 99.9% of everything, but I hate that remark from the, that famous comment from one of the introductions to one of the editions of Capital, where he derides, making recipes for the cook shops of the future. I think you damn well should make recipes for the cook shops of the future, or else that people won't believe that they'll have anything to eat in the future, if they don't get to see the recipe. And so if, like really my problem with what Chomsky is laying out, and I mean, I'm with you, Russell. I'm very much a, like, I don't, I mean, I think we need a state, right? So, and so like my critique, if anything, of what Chomsky is laying out is that it's still so vague, that it leads me to think that he hasn't, grappled with some of the hard problems there. And this is a pet peeve of mine in general, that people from that kind of anarchist tradition like Chomsky or certain kind of left communists or whatever will throw around these terms like federated and decentralized as if they like added up to some sort of convincing explanation of how any of this would work. And I think they very much don't, right? Like, so my go-to example that I always use to, to illustrate the point is to, I mean, I think I've definitely brought this up on previous live streams, but, just trot out one more time, is, okay, let's say we live in your favorite anarcho-syndicalist, future, and I'm accused of a crime. I mean, I guess we can will away we can just wish away the existence of crime in this future, but that seems a little unrealistic. So, I think that people would still, get angry at each other, and there'd be acts of interpersonal violence and, all that stuff. All right, so I'm accused of a crime.
Never.
And everybody in my commune thinks I did it. Is there some sort of judicial process that I could use to appeal for a change of venue? If so, that implies a certain degree of centralization, and that's the kind of thing, like I just start to get a little frustrated, with all of this, even aside from larger economic reasons or whatever that you might have, that you might think that that a state is going to be necessary, certainly under any kind of socialism we can realistically imagine in the near future. It wouldn't be like the kind of state that exists now, certainly.
Yeah.
And yes, which is why I actually think I completely agree. In the interview, I was pressing him a little on this, but I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Zizek's reason for, for trying for sort of preserving that word communism. That he wants to sort of hold on to the, like the suggestion that we're talking about a radical break, from what exists now. I mean, I think, whatever, like I said, I want to see the recipes, but in any case, I think, but on Foucault's critique, I think what bothers me is more of a sort of straightforward, maybe kind of stereotypical analytic philosophy kind of objection, which is, okay, let's say that there is some sense, I mean, without even getting into that Mao thing about human nature, that there is some sense in which that Marxism's conception of all those things that he just laid out is bourgeois, that it, go with your Foucaultian terms, that it's all stuff that comes out of or only makes sense in terms of, of the kind of episteme that you have in a bourgeois society. Okay, why is that bad? Why is that a problem? And it seems like any possible answer to why is that bad, it's going to be real hard to answer that question without actually thinking that you do have some sort of like value system or knowledge of all of this or something that isn't relative to different epistemes. That like that that if it's a problem that we've got, if he's right that Marxism has the bourgeois understanding of human nature, aesthetics, or whatever, why is that a problem? And it seems like the natural reason to think it would be a problem is that means that it's missing something about like, what the real truth is, or at least what the real normative goal should be about these things. But of course, the second you start talking like this, you've given up the whole project.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, Ben. And I should just say my favorite quote ever by Foucault, which is extraordinarily evocative, is where he said, "The soul is the prison for the body," which is a delightful kind of inversion of like some good old Christian kind of theology. But the kind of point that he was making with that, and I think this becomes really clear in his later work, is that he was committed to a kind of ethics, right? And ethics, not necessarily of self-liberation, but of self-creation. Again, what's sometimes defined as left Nietzscheanism, right? Or other word, or another fancier way to put it that might be more amenable to analytic philosophy is he's beholden to an expressivist ethic, right? And the weird thing about that is I don't think that's actually particularly anti-enlightenment at all. I actually think it's quite coincident with Chomsky's own approach that a society that emphasizes human creativity and potential to the maximal degree is the best one. And I think near the end of his life, he started to acknowledge that a little bit, as you see with the essay on enlightenment that Russell talked about later, where he was talking about the Kantian roots of critique and how he was fundamentally committed to a kind of enlightenment project that was just more historically and genealogically reflective than what you saw with the classical enlightenment period, right? Yeah. So I think that the differences between the two of them are actually less stark as time goes on. It's just that at points he would speak, particularly in this time period, with the kind of hyper-skepticism that Ben rightly criticized as ultimately unproductive.
Yeah, and I should say too, right? Like I really don't want to get lost in it. Like I don't actually have the attitude that like, Chomsky, later in his life and maybe a little bit grumpier than you see him here, has sometimes, expressed to Foucault. I mean, like I've read Foucault and thought, a lot of this is really interesting and insightful. Yeah. But as whatever, we're commenting on a debate, right? So this is going to be hyper focused on the differences between them, and as both of you have rightly emphasized, there's a lot that's actually in common. But as far as those differences, I think that this point, about those recipes for the cookshops of the future is a really important one, and one that ties into what I was saying earlier about power, and I think what Russell was saying about about not having, just sort of doing critique and not having a vision. Because if you're, I think the two are very closely aligned. This business about not sort of say, okay, everything is power. And then also like, okay, we don't actually have a positive vision of how we want society to work. And if everything is power, you can't even sort of extract the positive vision by implication from the things about existing society we don't like, because that's just like everything.
Yeah, there's a great book that this is making me think of. So great that the author's name is Timothy Brennan, called Wars of Position, a good sort of Gramscian title. But he basically, and I think the subtitle is something like the cultural politics of the left and right, and he essentially argues that what you get with everything being reduced to power is that the only, and this actually ties back to something that Matt said earlier about academics who, and they fully believe that they are radical, and that's part of the problem. But that the only position to inhabit, or the position that gets valorized in a certain type of like liberal left theory, is the position of being outside, of being liminal, of being on the border, of being marginalized, because any sort of being subaltern, because any sort of to be tainted in any way by the sort of brush of power ultimately means that you've you've capitulated or you're unfree. And so the only subject position that is worth inhabiting here, according to this particular line, is one that is on the fringe, is outside of power. And that all too easily, the reason why I mentioned this Brennan book, and others like Jody Dean have written about this, but the reason why that's a problem, or one of the reasons why that's a problem, is because it dovetails all too well with late capitalist, neoliberal, capitalist neoliberal policies of like picking and choosing and belonging or not belonging. And it's a much deeper issue. But I think that this is something.
No, I think that's right on. I mean, I really, I mean, I guess the two things that makes me think of are one, I kind of brought up dumbass Noah Berlasky earlier, but I think that the way that like the Berlatskys of the world like misunderstand what the Marxist point is about class and about workers is really, essentially ties in here. Because it's not like, Marxism emphasizes class because Marxists think that workers have it worse off than everybody else does. In a lot of the societies Marx was writing about where capitalism was emerging, peasants had way worse off in some ways than industrial workers and members, of a lot of women who couldn't work, lumpen proletarians, whatever, all had it worse off. Marx knew that. The point about workers isn't that they're the most deserving victims, or something like that. It's that they have a vested interest in, and they have the ability to transform society into something else. Right,
yes.
That's the point. And this obsession with whoever's the most subaltern really points in the opposite direction of that. It's that in fact you're focusing on those subjects that have the least power to do anything about the society that you're in, and that in turn does start to sound a lot like what my friend Freddie DeBoer calls pity charity liberalism. That we're I think about Amber Frost from Chapo, who's the other guest on the episode coming out tomorrow. There's an old episode of Chapo where she has this great line I've always loved, where she was talking about how, I think the guest, whoever the guest was talking about how one of the great things about going from being a liberal to being a socialist is that you can stop morally means testing people in your head, who deserves help. And she said, you can just say, every bastard deserves better, right? Like it's but we're not. Like you can have, and again, this goes back to Michael and Against the Web, that you can have that part of the importance of having a vision of a better society, is that you can and having a way of expressing that vision that would be appealing to a larger group of people is precisely to show, look, that this is, we want everybody to be better off, right, than they are right now. I mean, there are certain senses, that's just always been part of the Marxist critique, of that even the people who materially benefit from capitalism are made worse off by it in some ways. Yeah. But we want everybody to be better off. We're just interested in how we can get from A to B.
Yeah, Zizek actually articulated that point. We all seem to be big fans here, so I'm sure this you're probably familiar with this. In an article he wrote in 2018 about Israeli attacks on Palestinians, right? And invoking the memory of the Holocaust to justify Israeli oppression, right? And he used this, of course, to make a bigger theoretical point, which is that one of the problems with locating moral stature in a victim group is it kind of presumes moral insight on the part of these individuals, on the part of victims, that sometimes isn't there because, as he points out, and I think this is a good common sense view that's sometimes included, people can be victims while at the same time holding deeply immoral views about how to resolve their oppression, right? And he points out, that in the 1930s, many Germans had a lot of reasons to feel like they were victimized. Whether you're talking about by European powers or whether you're talking about the forces of global capital, that doesn't mean that the route they took to solve the problem was correct, right? And I would actually go a little bit further than that and point out to Wendy Brown's critique of Foucault, or I suppose I could broadly call it Foucauldianism in this respect, when she points out that a lot of times this rhetoric of victimization can just as easily be appropriated to advance reactionary causes as it can progressive causes. And Corey Robin pointed this out in the book The Reactionary Mind also, right? Because it's very easy for conservatives to say, well, listen, you're the ones who are taking things away from us. You're destroying our traditions. You're destroying our culture. You're removing rights, for example, rights of property that we've held for a long time. Who are you to do this? This is why we need somebody, a strong man like Trump, to come in and curb this process of victimization. And I think the way that we push against that is precisely by saying what Ben did, right? Which is, no, we are taking some things away from you, certain privileges, entitlements that enable you to disempower large groups of people. But that's precisely because we think it's important for everyone to be empowered in a relatively egalitarian fashion. Right?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, No, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say what like this again is why it's important to have a positive vision, because I mean, everybody's like, I mean, look, we're all victims of something or other from the right point of view. The question is like, how is that different from the way that we, how is whatever everybody is experiencing right now different from the way that we want it to be? And I think that's just an inescapable question, I mean, look, politics, to the extent that you're doing, that you're not doing this, I think you're doing something other than politics. Politics is about is about trying to change things in some way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I should say that Corey Robin had a great comment about this. I think it was in 2016 interview, just when the book was 2014 interview when his book was becoming a bestseller, and he said, "Look, a lot of times we on the left try to suggest that conservatives don't have any reason to feel like victims, but actually they do have a reason to feel like victims. Just like every powerful person that's stripped of their power has a reason to feel like a victim. The question isn't are they victims of something; it's are they entitled to have what we took away from them." And that's where I'd say no one's entitled to have the capacity to exploit someone in the way that you see under neoliberal capitalist conditions. No one's entitled to have so many privileges that they can relegate an other gender to subordination, and you can run through the list that way.
Which is exactly, I mean, just to take one last whack at this, dead horse, that's exactly why it's important that we put forward some sort of theory of who is in fact entitled to what and what that would look like.
Yeah, completely agree.
All right, let's watch a little more.
Okay.
Well, you see, I think that in the intellectual domain of political action, that is the domain of trying to construct a vision of a just and free society on the basis of some notion of human nature. In that domain, we face the very same problem that we face in immediate political action. For example, to be quite concrete, a lot of my own activity really has to do with the Vietnam War, and a good deal of my own energy goes into civil disobedience. Well, civil disobedience in the United States is an action undertaken in the face of considerable uncertainties about its effects. For example, it threatens the social order in ways which, let's say, one might argue, bring on fascism. That would be very bad for America, for Vietnam, for Holland, and for everyone else. So there's a danger, that is one danger in undertaking this concrete act. On the other hand, there's a great danger in not undertaking it. Namely, if you don't undertake it, the society of Indochina will be torn to shreds by American power. And in the face of those uncertainties, one has to choose a course of action. Well, similarly, in the intellectual domain, one is faced with the uncertainties that you correctly pose. Our concept of human nature is certainly limited, partial, socially conditioned, constrained by our own character defects and the defects and the limitations of the intellectual culture in which we exist. Yet at the same time, it's of critical importance that we have some direction, that we know what impossible goals we're trying to achieve if we hope to achieve some of the possible goals. And that means that we have to be bold enough to speculate and create social theories on the basis of partial knowledge while remaining very open to the strong possibility, in fact, overwhelming probability, that at least in some respects we're very far off the mark.
Well, perhaps it is interesting to go on a little bit further on this problem of strategy. So, for example, in the case of Holland, we had something like a population census. You were obliged to fill in your papers and so on, you know. So this you would call, if you are not filling in your papers, civil disobedience.
Right. Now, I would be a little careful about that because going back to some very important point that Mr. Foucault made, one does not necessarily allow the state to define what is legal. Now, the state has the power to enforce a certain concept of what is legal, but power doesn't imply justice or correctness even. So the state may define something as civil disobedience and may be wrong in doing so. For example, in the United States, the state defines it as civil disobedience to, let's say, derail an ammunition train that's going to Vietnam. And the state is wrong in defining that as civil disobedience because it's legal and proper and should be done. It's proper to carry out actions that will prevent the criminal acts of the state, just as it's proper to violate a traffic ordinance in order to prevent a murder. If I was standing at a street corner and the traffic light were red, let's say I was standing in my car and I drove across the traffic light to prevent somebody from, let's say, machine gunning a group of people, of course that's not violation of law. It's an appropriate and proper action. No sane judge would convict you for such an action. Similarly, a good deal of what the state authorities define as civil disobedience is not really civil disobedience. In fact, it's legal, in fact, obligatory behavior in violation of the commands of the state, which may or may not be legal commands. So one has to be rather careful about calling things illegal, I think.
Oui, mais alors là, je voudrais vous poser une question. Quand vous êtes aux États-Unis, lorsque vous faites une action franchement illégale,
which I regard as illegal, not just the state.
no, when the state, an
The
action
state
that
regards
the
as illegal.
state considers as illegal.
Yeah.
Est-ce que vous faites cette action parce que vous la trouvez juste
Yeah.
en vertu d'une justice idéale, ou bien est-ce que vous la faites parce que la guerre de classe la rend utile et nécessaire?
Well,
Est-ce que vous vous référez à une justice idéale? Voilà
again,
le problème.
very often when I do something which the state regards as illegal, I regard it as legal
Yes, that's
because
it.
I regard the state as criminal.
Alors,
But in some instances, that's not true. That is, let me be quite concrete about it and move from the area of class war to imperialist war, where the situation is somewhat clearer and easier. Take international law, a very weak instrument as we know, but nevertheless it incorporates some rather interesting principles. Well, international law in many respects is the instrument of the powerful. That is, international law permits much too wide a range of international forceful intervention in support of existing power structures that define themselves as states and against the interests of masses of people who happen to be organized in opposition to states. But in fact, international law is not solely of that kind. And in fact, there are interesting elements of international law, let's say embedded in the United Nations Charter, which permit, in fact, I believe, require the citizen to act against his own state in ways that the state will falsely regard as criminal.
Just want to chime in and say, again, another very Kantian point here about the virtue of cosmopolitan institutions.
Or use of force.
Yeah, right. The was it perpetual peace essay?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. I mean, I think he's absolutely right that, you know, there's all kinds of problems with international law, but recognizing it as a kind of transcendent ideal that regulates the legitimacy of state by making them beholden to some cosmopolitan standard, right? It's exactly what Kant espoused in that essay.
In international affairs, except under some very narrow circumstances, of which, for example, the war in Vietnam is not one, which means that in the particular case of, let's say, the Vietnam War, the one that interests me most, the American state is acting in a criminal capacity, and people have the right to stop criminals from murdering people. Just because the criminal happens to call your action illegal when you try to stop him, that doesn't mean it is illegal. I mean, a perfectly clear case of that is the present case of the Pentagon Papers in the United States, which I suppose you know about. Reduced to its essentials and forgetting legalism, what is happening is that the state is trying to prosecute people for exposing its crimes. That's what it amounts to.
C'est donc au nom d'une justice plus pure que vous critiquez le fonctionnement de la justice? Parce que c'est pour moi, si vous voulez, important de savoir ça, parce que nous avons actuellement en France un débat sur le problème de la justice et à propos de l'institution d'un tribunal populaire à propos de la justice. Vous connaissez le problème des... Et un certain nombre de gens, comme Sartre par exemple, pensent que pour faire actuellement la critique du système pénal en France, ou pour faire la critique de des pratiques policières, de la manière dont la police se conduit, il faut faire une sorte de tribunal qui, au nom d'une justice idéale, d'une justice supérieure, d'une justice humaine en général, condamnera la pratique des juges français ou des policiers français. Et puis, il y a un autre groupe de gens, et je me sens, enfin, je travaille avec ces gens-là, qui disent non, il ne faut pas faire cela parce que quand vous vous référez à la justice idéale que le tribunal serait censé appliquer, vous vous référez en fait à un certain nombre d'idées de justice qui ont été formées à notre époque par un certain groupe d'individus qui sont eux-mêmes, malgré tout, d'une façon directe ou indirecte, les produits de la société dans laquelle nous nous trouvons. Il faut attaquer les pratiques de la justice, il faut attaquer la police, il faut attaquer les pratiques policières, mais en termes de guerre et non pas en termes de justice.
But you see, surely you believe that your role in the war is a just role, that you're fighting a just war, to bring in a concept from another domain. And that, I think, is important. If you thought that you were fighting an unjust war, you couldn't follow that line of reasoning. And the only, see, I would like to slightly...
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just an inescapable point, right?
Yeah, again, I follow the point that I take the point that there's an ambulance going by or something. Siren. I take the point that that what is considered justice here is, I mean, his point right is that it's constructed, it's conditioned, but you know, a part of me seems like I want to say that actually Foucault is more anarchist than more than Chomsky in a way, because it's a form of it's not epistemological skepticism, but it's actually like in the name of this sort of epistemological approach that any sort of like undergirding is being removed. And so what would his, I don't know what his answer would be there. I mean, I would be on the side of Chomsky, and I mean, he mentioned Sartre earlier. I'd be on the side of Sartre here.
Yeah. I mean, your anti-foundationalism can only go so far before you're bereft of any kind of reason to actually undertake any form of action. And I mean, the only way he seems to be able to solve this problem is by saying just what he said, right? Well, the struggle itself is important, to which you might rebut, okay, well, the struggle for what and why, right?
Yeah, why is it important? What's the let's really dig into this. Like, is it normatively important, right? I mean, like, then there's some sort of, seems like, you know, there is some kind of background, you know, value system there. And I guess I'd point out, right, that I think that, you know, what Foucault is saying here certainly, you know, has a very Marxist flavor to it. And I run into this sometimes, you know, from people who, you know, are, it's very important to their self-conception that, you know, they think of themselves as like really hardcore materialists, that and that like you sort of start to use any kind of, you know, remotely normative language, you know, their alarm bells start going off. And they'll say, well, but I mean, how can, you know, whatever, like if you like Rawls, you know, then that's you know, that's anti-Marxist or whatever, you know, and I think like I get the point, but also I think for reasons that Chomsky is pointing to here, you know, with that very simple question, right? Like, okay, right, so sure, let's talk about the class war, but you consider yourself to be a just war from the working class perspective, right? Like it's very like it's going to be very, very hard to avoid saying something normative somewhere in here. And I would also point out that for what it's worth, like just as, I mean, not that he's infallible or anything, like he could have been wrong, but just as an interesting bit of historical trivia, Frederick Engels at least seems to have been on the Chomsky side of this argument.
Yeah.
Because I remember there's a remark, I want to say it's like maybe in the Anti-During, I'm not sure, where he says like, oh yeah, sure. So like these various like moral systems that were proposed are like a rationalization of, bourgeois society. But once we have a classless society, Engels says, then we can have a truly human morality.
Actually, this is a good segue where I can talk a little bit about Twitter nihilists. But no one saw that coming, because I see a lot of people invoking this kind of hyper anti-foundationalist, even nihilistic rhetoric, because they see it as emancipatory, right? Philosophically, right? Oh, if I'm an absolute anti-foundationalist and I'm a kind of nihilist, then I can just believe whatever I want. And actually, and this is kind of a technical point, Bernard Williams in his book Morality points out that actually few things are as epistemologically or normatively constraining as being a consistent nihilist. Because if you're a consistent nihilist, you have to say, well, there's no reason whatsoever to do anything, right? And so since there's no kind of reason-giving foundation for any of your actions, there can't be any kind of justificatory quality to them, right? And nobody actually wants to find themselves in that position, because then you wind up in exactly these kind of dilemmas. Okay, well, you think it's important to struggle. Why? Right? What exactly are you trying to accomplish by doing this?
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I think that comment I just quoted from Engels about the true human morality, I mean, I think that's ambiguous in all sorts of ways, right? We could have a whole discussion about what that could mean, but I do tend to think that probably like what he meant by that is pretty close to some of what Chomsky's been laying out here. Both because this idea that of like human capacity, whether you like or don't like the phrase human nature, right? That like this idea that human capacity for creative expression is in some sense incredibly important to whatever we could be, right? Our species being, and that it's constrained under class society, and that we should be trying to liberate that potential. And again, that idea that that you could in the future have a truly human morality, I think really suggests some of what Chomsky said a few minutes ago, that about how of course our ideas about all these things are necessarily constrained by, he gave that whole list of things, as character defects, systematic and institutional aspects of your society, et cetera. We're very far from having perfect access to these things, but that doesn't mean that you can escape talking in terms of them.
I should also say that one of the greatest sins that human nature has to bear is it was an inspiration for a really crappy Michael Jackson song on Thriller. One of the few crappy songs on that album. And for that, if nothing else, we should be skeptical of it.
All right.
So, it picks up right after that, though. Isn't PYT right after that?
It does, yeah. One of the only weak songs on that album, but it's definitely a downer.
Yeah. For a second there, I thought you were going to say something negative about Thriller itself, and I'd have to cut you off in the live stream, and Russell and I would have to just finish this on our own.
Oh no, creepy God! But I mean, that album's pretty close to perfect, right? No, that song is the low.
Fair enough. All right, let's watch a few more minutes.
Legality and ideal justice. It's rather between legality and better justice. Now, this better system may have its defects, certainly will, but comparing the better system with the existing system and not being confused into thinking that our better system is the ideal system, we can then argue, I think, as follows, that the concept of legality and the concept of justice are not identical. They're not entirely distinct either. Insofar as legality incorporates justice in this notion, in this sense of better justice, referring to a better society, then we should follow and obey the law, and force the state to obey the law, and force the great corporations to obey the law, and force the police to obey the law, if we have the power to do so. Of course, if in those areas where the legal system happens to represent not better justice, but rather the techniques of oppression that have been codified in a particular autocratic system, well, then a reasonable human being should disregard and oppose them, at least in principle. He may not, for some reason, do it in fact.
Alors, je voulais simplement répondre à votre toute première phrase quand vous avez dit « Mais la guerre que vous faites contre la police, si vous ne considériez pas qu'elle est juste, vous ne la feriez pas. » Alors, je vous répondrai un peu en termes de Spinoza. Je vous dirai « Le prolétariat ne fait pas la guerre à la classe dirigeante parce qu'il considère que cette guerre est juste. Le prolétariat fait la guerre à la classe dirigeante parce qu'il veut, pour la première fois dans l'histoire, prendre le pouvoir. Et c'est parce qu'il veut prendre le pouvoir qu'il considère que sa guerre est juste.
Yeah, I don't agree
On fait la guerre pour gagner et pas parce qu'elle est juste.
I don't personally agree with that. For example, if I could convince myself that attainment of power by the proletariat would lead to a terroristic police state in which freedom and dignity and decent human relations would be destroyed, then I wouldn't want the proletariat to take power. In fact, the only reason for wanting any such thing, I believe, is because one thinks, rightly or wrongly, that some fundamental human values will be achieved by that transfer of power.
Alors, je vous répondrai ceci. Quand le prolétariat prendra le pouvoir, il se peut bien que le prolétariat exerce à l'égard des classes dont il vient de triompher, il exerce un pouvoir violent, dictatorial et même sanglant. Je ne vois pas quelle objection on peut faire à cela. Maintenant, vous me direz, et si le prolétariat exerce ce pouvoir sanglant, tyrannique et injuste à l'égard de lui-même, le prolétariat? Alors je vous répondrai, ça ne peut se produire que si le prolétariat n'a pas réellement pris le pouvoir, mais c'est qu'une classe extérieure au prolétariat ou un groupe de gens intérieurs au prolétariat, une bureaucratie ou les restes de la petite bourgeoisie.
I have to say, as sales pitches, I've heard better.
Well, I'm not at all satisfied with that theory of revolution for a lot of reasons, historical and other. But even if one were to accept it for the sake of argument, still that theory is maintaining that it is proper for the proletariat to take power and exercise it in a violent and bloody and unjust fashion because it is claimed, in my opinion, falsely, that will lead to a more just society in which the state will wither away, in which the proletariat will be a universal class, and so on and so forth. If it weren't for that further justification, the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat, violent and bloody, would certainly be unjust. At least I, for example, am not a committed pacifist. That is, I would not hold that it is under all imaginable circumstances wrong to use violence, even though use of violence is in some sense unjust. I believe that one has to estimate relative injustices. But the use of violence and the creation of some degree of injustice can only itself be justified on the basis of the claim and the assessment, which always ought to be undertaken very, very seriously and with a good deal of skepticism, that this violence is being exercised because a more just result is going to be achieved. If it does not have that grounding, it really is totally immoral, in my opinion.
Je ne pense pas que l'idéal de la guerre de classe, enfin le but que se propose le prolétariat en menant la guerre de classe, je ne crois pas qu'on puisse dire, enfin qu'il soit suffisant de dire que c'est une plus grande justice. Ce que le prolétariat veut faire en chassant la classe actuellement au pouvoir et en prenant pour lui le pouvoir, c'est la suppression précisément d'un pouvoir de classe en général.
Okay.
Car le prolétariat... Hein?
That is the further justification.
Ça c'est la justification, mais pas en termes de justice, en termes de pouvoir.
But it is in terms of justice. It's because the end that will be achieved, it is claimed, is a just end. If no Leninist or whatever you like would dare to say we have a right to take power, let's say we, the proletariat, and then throw everyone else into crematoria, let's say. I mean, if that were the consequence of the proletariat taking power, of course it would not be appropriate. The idea is, and as for reasons I mentioned, I'm skeptical about it, that a period of violent dictatorship, of perhaps violent and bloody dictatorship, is justified because that will mean the submergence and termination of class oppression, a proper end to achieve in human life.
Mais il me semble que de toute façon, la notion même de justice fonctionne à l'intérieur de la société de classe comme revendication du côté de la classe opprimée et comme justification du côté de la classe oppressée.
I don't agree with that.
Et dans une société sans classe, je ne suis pas sûr qu'on ait encore à utiliser cette notion de justice.
Yeah. Well, here I really disagree. I think that there is a sort of an absolute basis. If you press me too hard, I'll be in trouble because I can't sketch it out. But some sort of an absolute basis ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded.
One cheer on my part for quasi-cognitivist realism. That's my meta-ethical preference.
I think it's too hasty to characterize our existing systems of justice as merely systems of class oppression. I don't think that they are that. I think that they embody systems of class oppression, and they embody elements of other kinds of oppression. But they also embody a kind of a groping towards the true humanly valuable concept of justice and decency and love and kindness and sympathy and so on, which I think are real.
Bon, est-ce que j'ai du temps pour répondre? Combien? Parce que
2 minutes.
Ben, moi, je dirais que c'est injuste.
Absolutely.
Non, mais bon, je ne veux pas répondre en si peu de temps. Je dirais simplement ceci. Je ne peux pas m'empêcher, contrairement à ce que vous pensez, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de croire que cette notion de nature humaine, cette notion de bonté, de justice, d'essence humaine, de réalisation de l'essence humaine, tout ça, ce sont des notions et des concepts qui ont été formés à l'intérieur de notre civilisation, dans notre type de savoir, dans notre forme de philosophie, et que par conséquent, ça fait partie même de notre système de classe, et qu'on ne peut pas, aussi regrettable que ce soit, on ne peut pas faire valoir ces notions pour décrire ou justifier un combat qui doit en principe bouleverser les fondements même de notre société. Il y a là une extrapolation dont je n'arrive pas à trouver la justification historique.
Well, I think we can start immediately the discussion. And
Mr. Chomsky, I would ask you one question. In your discussion, you had the vocabulary of proletariat. We as proletarian. It's the irony of history that at the moment, young intellectuals coming from middle class and upper class call themselves proletarians and say we must join the proletarians. But I don't see any class conscious proletarians. That's a great dilemma.
It is not true in our given society that all people are doing useful, productive work or self-satisfying work. Obviously, it's very far from true. Those people, lots of people who are excluded from the possibility of productive labor. And I think the revolution, if you want, should be in the name of all human beings, but it will have to be conducted by certain categories of human beings, and those will be I think the human beings who really are involved in the productive work of society. Now, what that is will differ depending on the society. In our society, it, I think, includes intellectual workers. So I think that the student revolutionaries, if you like, have a point, a partial point. That is, it's a very important thing in a modern advanced industrial society. It's very important how the trained intelligentsia identify themselves, if they're going to be technocrats, let's say, or servants of either the state or private power, or alternatively, whether they're going to identify themselves as part of the workforce who happen to be doing intellectual labor. If the latter, then they can and should play a decent role in a progressive social revolution. If the former, then they're part of the class of the oppressors.
I have an additional, one small additional question or more remark to you. That is that you, with your very courageous attitude towards the war in Vietnam, how can you survive in an institution like MIT, which is known here as one of the great war contractors and intellectual makers of this war?
There are two aspects to that. One is the question how MIT tolerates me, and the other question is how I tolerate MIT. Well, as to how MIT tolerates me, here again, I think one shouldn't be overly schematic. It's true that MIT is a major institution of war research, but it's also true that it embodies very important libertarian values, which are, I think, quite deeply embedded in American society, fortunately for the world. They're not deeply embedded enough to save the Vietnamese, but they're deeply enough embedded to prevent far worse disasters. And here I think one has to be a bit qualified. That is, there is imperial terror and aggression, there is exploitation, there is racism, lots of things like that. But there's also a real concern coexisting with it for individual rights of a sort which, for example, are embodied in the Bill of Rights, which is by no means simply an expression of class oppression. It is also an expression of the necessity to defend the individual against state power. Now, these things coexist, you know. It's not that simple. It's not just all bad or all good. And it's because it's the particular balance in which they coexist that makes it, that makes an institute that produces weapons of war be willing to tolerate, in fact, you know, in many ways even encourage, to be quite honest, a person who's involved in civil disobedience against the war. Now, as to how I tolerate MIT, that raises another question. There are people who argue, and I've never understood the logic of this, that a radical ought to dissociate himself from all oppressive institutions.
That'd be the Foucauldian position.
The logic of that argument is that Karl Marx shouldn't have studied in the British Museum, which, if anything, was the symbol of, you know, the most vicious imperialism in the world, the place where all the treasures of empire were gathered, you know, the rape of the colonies was all poured in there, and so on and so forth. But I think Karl Marx was quite right in studying in the British Museum. He was right in using the resources and, in fact, the liberal values of the civilization that he was trying to overcome against it. And I think the same applies in this case.
But aren't you afraid that your presence at MIT gives them a clean conscience?
I don't see how, really. I mean, I think my presence at MIT serves marginally to, I hope a lot, I don't know how much, to increase student activism against a lot of the things that MIT stands for example.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this has to be the end of the debate. Mr. Chomsky, Mr. Foucault, I thank you very much for your far-going discussion.
Was there no question for Foucault? I don't remember that.
Political way. I thank you very much, both.
Yeah, that's odd.
Of the audience here and at home.
It might have been more familiar to European audiences at this point, though. I imagine Chomsky has kind of a exotic novelty to him, as you know, the American in Europe.
Yeah, that last man, that last question, that's like, that could be some you know, very online leftist in 2020.
Yeah, it could.
You know,
the point about, I mean, I agree with Chomsky that I don't think you can say, as Foucault does, that under, it's not as though in a classless society, power disappears, right? Or that I don't think that in after the proletarian revolution that all of a sudden our notion of justice dissolves because justice is inherently tied in with with power different or class difference. I don't see that at all. But
yeah, no, that seems. I mean, right. Clearly, I think that Lee Phillips, I've had some good discussions about this with him. That's like this idea that you have in certain strands of Marxist thought that that politics, normative disagreement is just gonna cease at the end of capitalism is just really strange, right? Because even if you don't, for one thing, even if you don't have class divisions, that doesn't mean that you don't have sectional divisions. In fact, I think if you look at the history of communist Yugoslavia, for example, which was in some ways, it was complicated, and in some ways it was a lot like the other Eastern European states, but in some ways it was different. There's a greater degree of workers' autonomy and other things, but there were huge debates about essentially the distribution of resources, between different republics within Yugoslavia and different areas. And I think that to some extent that's just inescapable, right? That either you have a Stalin figure, who just decides all that stuff and kills everybody else, or you're going to have debates about those things. And then also, they're just going to be. I think they're just remaining normative, ideological differences like that. Think about drug prohibition. That it's certainly the case that I think probably most, right? Most drug abuse has to do with poverty and unjust social conditions. But I think even if you look at the existing society, there are plenty of people with drug problems who aren't materially deprived. And I think that some of that's, and I think some of the reasons for that would continue to exist in a classless society. And so I don't see any reason why you wouldn't have a division, a political division between people who had more paternalistic versus more libertarian attitudes about drug use, that seems like, of course that would exist, or even just stupid stuff. I remember Lee's example was you have, some sort of state economic planning board, that they, wants to run, some cables, through your backyard. And then you go out to get upset about that. And, whoever wins that fight, I mean, that is still a political battle about, the use of, their use of resources and who's entitled to what.
Yeah. Rawls actually had a very good critique of Marx. I don't want to say Marx actually, but kind of vulgar Marxism on this point, where he said various iterations of vulgar Marxism are dependent upon a future scenario in which there are conditions of non-resource scarcity, right? And he points out that the reality is that even in a very rich society, we're always going to be under conditions of relative scarcity. And because of that, we're going to have to make decisions, probably political and normative decisions, about how it is that resources are going to be allocated, right? And one of the examples he gives is even in a very rich society, you can choose to invest billions of dollars in having an excellent healthcare program, or you can choose to invest billions of dollars in having world-class education, right? But at some point, you have a limited amount of resources, and you have to adjudicate what takes priority, right? Do you try to extend people's life expectancy by another year, or do you guarantee people universal post-secondary education, right? And I certainly think in a post-capitalist society that's democratically organized and that's very affluent, a lot of these problems can be mediated democratically and in a non-exploitative manner, which is what we see right now. But I don't think you're ever going to overcome them completely the way some iterations of vulgar Marxism hope, right?
Yeah, and I should say too, somebody in the chat points out that the Yugoslav experience, some of that was about, quite a bit of course, was about underlying, unresolved ethnic conflict, which is certainly true. But then again, I think that actually reinforces the point, that I don't actually expect ethnic prejudice to wither away as soon as we've expropriated the means of production.
I'm just thinking how much Slavoj would have loved to talk about this before former Yugoslav communism.
Yeah.
Very nostalgic. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is very true. I was actually also thinking about him earlier, watching that last part of the debate where I think Chomsky, Foucault was kind of trying to hammer Chomsky to get him to admit that he had what he saw as this, as this unmaterial idealist, conception of justice. And Chomsky was trying to hammer Foucault to say, yeah, but come on, so do you, so does everybody, you can't escape it. And something that, well, I mean, I've heard him say this in other interviews, but something that Slavoj said in his discussion with me is he made this point that he's liked to make lately about how, that socialists should unapologetically say, like, oh, we're like the like Bernie Sanders social democracy, that's like the real moral majority.
Yeah, actually, this is what I was thinking actually at the end of this debate, because I stand by a lot of what Foucault says, particularly his extraordinarily interesting creative analyses of power, which I think were deeply innovative for their time and continue to be read with profit to this day. But I do find the kind of rhetorical strategy he adopted of trying to avoid the burdens of moral judgment by just consistently retreating into various forms of anti-foundationalism really developed a lot of really helped contribute to a lot of bad habits people on the left have, where, to invoke Slavoj, they don't say what they want and stand by it, right? There's always this, well, we can't make universalist claims, or I'm only speaking for myself, or I'm only speaking on behalf of my group, and so on. And I think that not only is this theoretically bad, it's rhetorically not a great strategy, because sometimes there really is a virtue in just saying, look, what we want is X, Y, and Z. And Paul Bent's point, we're the real moral majority, so we're going to get it one way or another, right? And that's just and right, and it's what should happen.
Well, you do kind of see that when Foucault is reluctant and almost like annoyed at the the moderator asking him a personal question, because for Foucault, like, he wants the personal to be, whereas Chomsky very clearly like interjects and will say something like, I mean, politely, but see, well, there I really disagree, and Foucault doesn't necessarily he's so reluctant to inhabit any sort of position other than the anti-foundationalist one that he can't articulate a position necessarily himself. Although, as both of you have been saying, like, there are all sorts of like sort of normative claims ensconced or sort of like, hidden, and that come in the back door along with that sort of reticence.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, I think one of the best moments for Chomsky in that debate was just think like when Foucault was saying, but like the reason for the working class to wage the class war, it's not justice, it's this, it's that, it's the other. I mean, I think that was the part where Chomsky was the strongest, because he was like, in each, it's X, it's Y. It's an American podcast. Thank you very much, Z. And Chomsky just kept coming back with, but why do you want X? Why do you want Y? Why do you want Z? Right? Like, presumably there's some sort of underlying thing here about how you think X, Y, and Z is going to be a normatively better outcome. That it's an outcome that there's some value reason why you prefer that. The end of all class society. Sure, I want that too, but why?
Yeah, I actually thought that was a little bit of an odd moment, right? Because you hear Foucault talking these very revolutionary terms about blood and dictatorship and power and violence, and you think, okay, well, there's really got to be a big payoff at the end of all this to make that worth it. And when it comes time to legitimate that payoff, he kind of backs away and says, well, no, it's not really about justice, it's about power. And I think Chomsky very rightly points out, like, well, yeah, but if you're going to call for blood and terror and dictatorship and stuff, there's going to be a really big payoff at the end normatively to make that all okay. And if you're unwilling to say that, then it begs the question of, well, why should we go through all that then?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's I mean, like, surely yes. And this is also a question that you're going to have to answer. I mean, I think there's a certain point where Foucault was talking about like where Foucault was raising, like, okay, so are we actually talking about the proletariat being in power, or some sort of bureaucratic or or petty bourgeois layer or whatever? And the two questions are not unrelated, because if you're going to get the majority of society to go along with some sort of bloody reign of terror, they better believe that something really good is going to come at the end of it, or they're just not going to go along with it for
give them a noble lie, at least.
Right. Exactly. If they don't even have that, you're definitely not going to get a stable majority of working class, standing behind your, committee of public safety, doing whatever it's doing during the during its terror, and it's I mean, why would anybody, go?
Okay, we just want power, right? Is that?
Yeah, and again, it's even kind of weird because I think this is one of those things. It's like the there's a book by Cornel West called "The American Invasion of Philosophy," where I remember at the beginning of it, he has this quote from Aristotle about how hard it is to express, anti-philosophical thoughts without falling into doing philosophy. And I think that you really see some of that with Foucault here at the end, that like, because look, I mean, Foucault, what he wants to do, I think you said this, Matt, earlier, is history. I mean, that's what this is the center for everything for him, and whatever. I mean, he has some like actually very interesting, insightful things to say about history, but then he's trying to be anti-normative, to say that we shouldn't think about any sort of larger values or or ideological goals really that could that we care about, that could justify a certain political course of action. And then, like he said, oh, okay, so what's the what's the goal if not some sort of appealing, better vision of how things should be? And then at that point, like I think that it's Foucault at his least insightful because it's just sort of reduced to mumbling something or other about power. But it's like, okay, but come on, spell that out for me, brother. What's the
If it's all about power and this power is what we should resist.
Right.
In other words, like if the proletarian revolution is all about like because they have and want the power to display, then what? I don't understand why Foucault would want to associate himself with leftism. It doesn't.
And this gets down to the Corey Robin point that Matt was bringing up earlier, because hold on, I mean, the second you implement some sort of revolutionary reign of terror, then the remaining royalists hanging out in attics become the most subaltern voices that are that are on the scene in the new arrangement. So should like buy your own lights, like if that's what you're fixated on, shouldn't you be identifying with them?
Marie Antoinette is the most subaltern.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to defend him for a few seconds, I do think it is entirely possible to go the other way to a ridiculous extreme also, which is what you see with the IDW, right? Where you essentially evoke a rhetoric of reason and logic and truth and naturalness in order to justify what are really very unstable and historically determined positions, right? And I think it's all well and good for Foucault to criticize those wherever they happen to emerge, right? I just think we don't think that it's necessary to go all the way from criticizing, rhetorics of reason, universalism that are used to supplement and legitimate disciplinary and other forms of power, and then go to anti-foundationalism, strict anti-foundationalism, whether about epistemological or normative questions, right? I just don't see why we can't have our cake and eat it too on this point.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and really, like, I think that Chomsky was, having his cake and eating it on this because he was, very, very cheerfully acknowledging, right? That yeah, of course, right? I mean, like we have, there are all sorts of ways in which any sort of perspective that even, the most radical, thinker could have about this right now is going to bear the stamp of all the limitations built into the current situation, right? No question. We don't have some sort of unmediated, access to the way that, to a perfect idea of justice or anything like that. That's why I said all we can do is put forward better justice. But better justice is completely compatible with thinking that it's quite likely that our great-grandchildren will in various ways be ashamed of us and be right to do so.
Yeah, I mean, if you think on the epistemological point, right, it's entirely possible to buy into the theory of evolution while at the same time saying, using it to justify social Darwinism or eugenics. We don't want any of that, right? There's a lot of respects in which scientism, even to this day, has been used to justify some pretty noxious positions.
Yeah, that's true too. Although I also think, like, my instinct is always to say, yeah, I mean, it has certainly, right, but like that the least useful response to that, right, like the least useful response to Charles Murray, saying that, that science, proves that, poor people, and especially black poor people, are genetically inferior.
Especially women.
Is to say, oh, well, never mind science then, right? Because then, like, you've just made a massive concession to him that he doesn't deserve.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, if anything, and this, what I kind of tried to invoke earlier, right? The rhetoric, Enlightenment rationalism was originally a tool for radicalism. And when we conceded to people, whether the IDW or other kinds of reactionaries, that we're handing them a big weapon that ultimately belongs, I think, in our hands, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, I think you can have like, so I think the two ways that, I mean, look, I mean, this might be a little simple-minded, but, I think when reactionaries try, what Michael called the naturalizing move, to justify everything in terms of science, my instinct is to say, look, there are two, there are two responses which we should both use in most of these cases. One of them is to point out all the ways in which once you start looking into it, they're at best oversimplifying, the science, which they always are, because it's ideologically motivated and it's bad faith. And two, to go back to the big thing that we've been talking about, for the last, few minutes, and that Chomsky and Foucault were talking about in the last, 20 minutes, right? I mean, to pull the David Hume card and say, yeah, but like nothing actually normatively follows from any of this, right? Like you have to, sure, like whatever, let's say you were right about the science, which you're not, but if you were, like, spell out why that means that whatever we have now is okay. I mean, all of your work is still ahead of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I did just want to say, actually, that one of the things that I think was interesting about this discussion and the debate is that, unlike our first crack at this, Ben, when we did Buckley v. Baldwin, we all seem to be a little bit more equivocal on who we agree with, right? We all seem to be like, well, he had some good points, he had some good points. So it's kind of interesting that way. So I think we can all agree that these are both brilliant guys, and there's a lot to learn from both of them. But I'm wondering, who would you say you fall down on a little bit more, or whose side you fall on a little bit more now that you've watched this again, if anyone?
I mean,
no, go ahead, Ben.
I mean, I guess I would just say on the issues that they were disagreeing about, and again, I think it is worth. Look, nobody in this debate is William F. Buckley, right? There was tons of stuff that sort of came up and they didn't really argue about because they basically agree about it. I mean, and so I do think that, like, especially in some of what he was saying about the history of science, that Foucault did make some, like, really good points. Of course, a lot of those really good points, Chomsky just said, yeah, I agree, right? So in terms of what they were disagreeing about, I think I have made some critical reservations about some things that Chomsky said, but yeah, overall, I'm in terms of what they separated them, I'm very much on Team Chomsky.
Yeah, I think I can't believe I'm saying this. It's not. I don't dislike Chomsky. But I think I'm probably. I mean, just because, especially our current moment, I think that the vision that Chomsky has for what constitutes a politics. Sorry, my dog is going crazy in the background. Is that, yeah, I would align myself with Chomsky. I think my sense of watching them interact is really interesting, because when I read, I remember reading it like years ago and thinking that Foucault was getting the better of him. So, but yeah, I mean, I think on the crucial questions that are important to us on the left today, that I think Chomsky won. But having said that, I do think, like, a number of the points he made, like the university system, for instance, when he was talking about all these more sort of micro versions of power that isn't just the police state, right, or like the state capital S and like military industrial complex. That, look, I mean, we talked about this earlier, that I think Ben mentioned the point that the majority of like academics are, Elizabeth Warren as opposed to Bert. So it's not an inherently radical
forward
or
as opposed to
egalitarian
Bernie
institution.
Sanders, as opposed to something that goes beyond Sanders. But yeah, totally.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I think that Foucault makes a number of sort of incontrovertible points that are crucial about especially for the goal of critique. But I do think that at the end of the day, like, I'd have to go with Chomsky here.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, right? And especially Russell, right? Like, I think that there's a lot more to learn from Foucault's analyses of power than there are from Chomsky. I enjoy manufacturing consent as much as anybody, but I wouldn't say it's quite as original or as edifying as Discipline and Punishment or any of the lectures on biopower and stuff. But when it comes to the kind of spirit of leftism that animates them, I think that Chomsky's, skeptical but constructive approach is a lot more valuable, and it is the kind of leftism that we need right now, right? I think that we've become a little bit too much mired in purely offering critiques, some of which go to kind of radically anti-foundationalist place that's ultimately unproductive. And I think what people really need and what they really want right now is some vision for the future that seems attainable but also more just in the kind of way that he's talking about. And I think that's kind of what we should be trying to offer, with all the reservations Foucault points out that come with that.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Like that's, that we do. Yeah, I mean, like having a really interested and nuanced, sense of how, the ways that power can operate, which is what Foucault at his best gives you is good. It's nice, right? It's a good thing to have. It certainly makes for a good read, and as you say, Matt, right, in some ways a much more stimulating read than most of Chomsky's political work. But at the same time, right, theses on Feuerbach, right? The point is to change it.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, guys. So definitely going to have both of you back to do this again.
It's fun.
And yeah, absolutely. So I might actually, I'm trying to come up with a way. So I'm trying to plan out, the next several of these, and I like the fact that so far a little bit, we've had a combination of the more directly political and the somewhat more philosophical debates. And I think that obviously this is much more recent than anything we've been done. But Russell, I was looking at YouTube and I was looking at the debate from just a couple of years ago that Zizek had with Graham Harman about.
Graham Harman. Okay.
Yeah.
That
about object-oriented ontology. And I was thinking that this, that I don't know how much I have to say about it, but I'd be interested to watch and have.
Harman published. It's totally friendly. Well, we're on good terms with Harman, but he just a few months ago published a. It's a response, but it's a critical response to mine and Slavoy's collection, in which we critique object-oriented ontology, but. The watching him with Graham Harman is really interesting. Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah. Okay. So let's for sure do that. And Matt, maybe when we do the Roger Scruton versus Terry Eagleton, I think that'll be a natural one for you to come back for.
Yeah. I can't promise I won't have some nasty things to say.
Well, I mean, this is YouTube. It is supposed to be entertainment as well as enlightenment. So I'm not gonna discourage you from saying nasty things. But in any case, thanks both of you guys. This is a lot of fun. I should say I am Coleman in the chat. By the way, I should say I did read your comment. I don't have anything immediate to say about it, but I'm going to think about it. Although people in the chat trying to pull me back into Twitter bullshit from which this is a welcome escape, you should feel ashamed of yourselves. As I already mentioned, the next regular episode is going to come out tomorrow, featuring Slavoj Žižek and Amber Frost, and on Wednesday. Going to be back with our producer Forrest for another one of the movie live streams, talk about Goodfellas, and on
Casino's better.
I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah. Actually, also Russ, you should come on for a movie stream someday. But bring us some literary analysis. But in any case, and on next Sunday for the next installment in the debate series, Bhaskar Sunkar is going to be on. We haven't 100% decided yet, but it's probably going to be the firing line debate between William F. Buckley and Michael Harrington about poverty, or if not, it'll be something like that. That's on that's going to be on next Sunday. The second, since there's going to be no regular episode, the week, a week from tomorrow, because that's the week between Christmas and New Year's, we're not going to do that. But there's in the bag. There's another one of those Sopranos recap bonus episodes, so we'll just premiere that at the usual time, and then we'll be back to the regular schedule the Monday after that with Richard Wolff. So all good stuff. Thank you everybody for coming and saying asking interesting questions and watching along with us. So just going to cut it there. So left is best.